She walked into court calm and composed. 17-year-old Brianna Berrezzini, charged with stabbing her former best friend to death, and she sat there like she was untouchable. Her lawyers told her she'd walk free. Self-defense, they said. Clean record, they promised. She believed them. Halia Culbertson's family sat right behind her, grieving, shattered. She barely glanced their way. The surveillance video showed her backing away from the fight. It looked like fear. It looked like she had no choice. But then the prosecutor stood up and read her text messages out loud. Messages she sent days before the stabbing. Messages where she said she'd slice Halia if she came near her. The courtroom went silent. Her confident expression cracked. And when the judge finally spoke, Brianna realized her own words had sealed her fate. Stories like this remind us that justice isn't just about who speaks loudest in court. It's about what the evidence can't hide. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. This isn't just another case of a fight gone wrong. This is the story of two former best friends whose lives unraveled over insults, threats, and a recovered addiction weaponized in public. Halia Culbertson was 17, outgoing, beloved by everyone who knew her, and working hard every single day to stay sober. Brianna Berrezzini was a college freshman with a clean record, a part-time job, and a knife from work that she carried in her pocket. On March 26, 2023, those two worlds collided outside a convenience store in Columbus, Ohio. What started as a confrontation over a single word, cokehead, ended with Halia bleeding out in a Jeep while her brother pressed his shirt to her chest, begging her to hold on. Brianna went home, showered, and put her clothes in the wash. By the time police arrived at her door, Halia was already gone. This is how it all began. Brianna Berrezzini sat at the defense table with her hands folded neatly in her lap, occasionally brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. To anyone watching, she looked like a scared teenager caught up in something bigger than herself. Her posture was small, almost fragile, and her voice when she spoke to her lawyers was soft and hesitant. But beneath that exterior was a girl who had been told again and again that she wouldn't face real consequences. And her legal team had built an entire narrative around her innocence, framing her as a victim forced to defend herself against an aggressive attacker. They had charts, they had timelines, they had Ohio's Stand Your Ground law printed and highlighted, and they had a surveillance video that seemed to show exactly what they needed it to show. The video became the centerpiece of the defense strategy. It showed Brianna emerging from the convenience store with drinks in her hands, completely unaware that her former best friend was waiting outside. It showed Halia Culbertson charging toward her, yelling, aggressive, ready for confrontation, and most importantly, it showed Brianna backing away, step after step after step. The defense counted them meticulously, 30 steps, 40 steps, maybe even 45. Brianna kept retreating, kept trying to create distance, kept telling Halia to back off. In that first telling, the jury was supposed to see a girl who didn't want to fight, a girl who was trying desperately to escape a situation she never asked for. It looked like textbook self-defense. It looked like fear in motion. But then the video stopped, and the prosecutor stood up with a different piece of evidence. Text messages. Messages that Brianna had sent about a week before the stabbing. Messages that her defense team had hoped would never see the light of day. Messages where she wrote, in her own words, that she would slice Halia if she came near her again, that she would cut her if she showed up at her family's home. These weren't panicked words typed in the heat of the moment. These were threats made days in advance, shared with friends, saved on a server somewhere in the digital cloud. They painted a very different picture, not a scared girl backing away, but a girl who had already decided what she would do if the confrontation ever happened. The emotional balance in the courtroom shifted the moment those messages were read aloud. Halia's family, sitting in the rows behind the prosecutor, felt a surge of validation mixed with rage. This was the proof they had been waiting for. Proof that Brianna wasn't just reacting. Proof that she had thought about this. Proof that when she walked into that parking lot with a knife in her pocket, it wasn't just a work tool she happened to be carrying. It was a weapon she had already imagined using. The defense tried to minimize the texts, arguing they were just angry words, the kind of things teenagers say when they're upset, and don't really mean. But the prosecution wasn't letting it go. They wanted the jury to understand that this wasn't spontaneous. This was premeditated rage waiting for an opportunity. Then the audio from the parking lot played. It was chaotic, full of overlapping voices, laughter, and the kind of energy that comes right before something terrible happens. John, you could hear people shouting, hyping up the fight, treating it like entertainment. One voice asked, "What you about to do, bro?" Another responded, "Where's she at, bro?" And then, chillingly, someone yelled at Halia, "Crunch your blank, get it over with, bro." The crowd was expecting a fist fight. They were expecting drama, maybe some hair-pulling, some shoving, the kind of thing that gets filmed and shared on social media for a few days before everyone forgets. No one in that parking lot thought they were about to witness a killing. No one thought the night would end with police tape and bloodstains on the asphalt. But it did. A crime scene photo flickered on the courtroom screen. Blood on the pavement outside a place called 161 Carry Out. Yellow police tape stretched across the storefront. The glow of a neon smoke shop sign reflected in the dark puddles. The date stamped in the corner read, March 27th, 2023. But the narrator's voice dropped to a somber tone as the facts were laid out plainly. 17-year-old Halia Culbertson died from a single stab wound to the neck. It happened in a parking lot full of people. It happened in front of cameras. It happened while friends laughed and filmed. And the proof of what really happened wasn't hidden. It was already on their phones, already saved, already time-stamped and geotagged and ready to be entered into evidence. And this wasn't just a case of a fight gone wrong. This was a collision of two lives that had once been intertwined. Two former best friends who shared secrets and inside jokes and late-night drives. Two girls who had turned against each other so completely that one ended up dead and the other ended up in handcuffs. Brianna Barazzini was a college freshman with no criminal record, a part-time job, and a family who believed in her innocence. Halia Culbertson was a recovering addict who fought every day to stay sober, surrounded by a family who loved her fiercely. And on one terrible night, an insult about addiction became the spark that ignited everything. The word cokehead was thrown like a grenade into a room full of gasoline. And when the smoke cleared, only one of them was still breathing. The courtroom sat in heavy silence as the opening statements concluded. Brianna's defense team believed they had a strong case. They believed the video would speak for itself. They believed a jury would see a scared girl who had no choice but to defend herself. But the prosecution had something stronger. They had Brianna's own words, words typed in anger, words that couldn't be unsaid. Words that proved she had thought about violence long before that parking lot. And as the judge prepared to move forward, one question hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. Was this self-defense? Or was this murder dressed up as fear? Halia Len Culbertson was the kind of person who lit up a room before she even said a word. At 17 years old, she moved through life with an openness that drew people to her like gravity. She was outgoing, social, always surrounded by friends who couldn't imagine their lives without her. She had this way of making strangers feel like they'd known her forever. A hug came first, a joke came second, and worrying about herself always came last. And in Northeast Columbus, where she grew up, Halia wasn't just known. She was loved. She was the girl who turned group chats into safe spaces, who made boring afternoons feel like adventures, who could diffuse tension with a smile and a perfectly timed laugh. If you needed someone to listen, she was there. If you needed someone to stand up for you, she was already on her feet. Her family was the foundation of everything she was, and Halia was raised in a close-knit circle that included her grandparents, Vicky Cashdollar and Harley Langley, who weren't just background figures in her life. They were woven into her daily routine. They were the ones cheering at her games, helping with rides, showing up for every milestone no matter how small. They were the ones who held her up when life got hard, and life had gotten hard. Halia wasn't just a typical teenager navigating high school drama and social media. She was fighting a battle that most people her age never have to face. She was a recovering addict, actively working on her sobriety, attending meetings, leaning on her family for support. Every single day she stayed clean was a quiet victory that no one outside her circle truly understood. It took strength most adults don't have, and she was doing it at 17. Her road to recovery wasn't something she hid. She owned it. She talked about it. She let people see her vulnerability because she believed that honesty was stronger than shame. But that openness also made her fragile in ways she couldn't always control. Addiction carries a stigma that doesn't wash off easily, and Halia knew that. She knew people whispered. She knew some people saw her past before they saw her present. And she knew that one wrong word, one cruel insult, could cut deeper than any physical wound. The word cokehead wasn't just an insult to her. It was an attack on everything she had worked so hard to leave behind. It was a public humiliation that stripped away months of progress and reduced her to the worst version of herself. And when that word was thrown at her in a crowded convenience store, it didn't just hurt. It ignited something. But before that night, Halia was thriving. Her friends remember her as the girl who could turn strangers into best friends in an afternoon. She had this magnetic energy that made people feel seen and valued. She wasn't the type to walk past someone sitting alone. She wasn't the type to let a friend cry without stepping in. She cared fiercely and loved loudly, and that made her both incredibly special and incredibly vulnerable. Because people like Halia, people who give so much of themselves, often don't see the danger coming until it's too late. They trust too easily. They forgive too quickly. They believe that love and loyalty are stronger than anger and resentment. And sometimes that belief costs them everything. While Halia was working to rebuild her life, her former best friend, Brianna Berrezzini, was building a very different narrative about her. In Brianna's version of events, Halia wasn't a girl in recovery trying to move forward. She was a threat. She was unstable. She was dangerous. And Brianna told police that Halia had gone crazy, that she had threatened to hurt her and slash her boyfriend's tires. She painted a picture of someone who was out of control, someone who couldn't be reasoned with, someone who might one day escalate to violence. Whether those threats were real, exaggerated, or completely imagined didn't matter in the end. What mattered was that Brianna believed them, or at least she convinced herself she believed them. And that belief became the foundation of everything that happened next. The uncertainty around those threats would become a central issue in the case. Did Halia actually say those things? Did she mean them? Or were they the kind of angry, empty words teenagers throw around when they're hurt and don't know how else to express it? Brianna's version suggested real fear. Halia's family insisted their daughter wasn't violent, that she was working on herself, that she wouldn't have gone looking for a fight. But whatever the truth was, those perceived threats rooted themselves deep in Brianna's mind. They transformed normal teenage conflict into something darker. They turned fear into obsession. And eventually, they became the justification for carrying a knife and using it. The contrast between the two girls' lives in the months leading up to that night was stark. Halia was surrounded by people who celebrated her progress. Her grandparents were proud of how far she'd come. Her friends saw her strength. Her siblings watched her fight every day to stay on the right path. She was moving forward, one small victory at a time. Meanwhile, Brianna was quietly preparing for a confrontation she believed was inevitable. She carried a knife. She sent threatening texts. She told friends what she would do if Halia ever came near her. On the surface, her life looked normal. College classes, part-time work, suburban routines. But underneath, she was rehearsing violence in her mind, and when the two of them finally collided, it wasn't a surprise. It was a tragedy everyone should have seen coming. The chapter closes on a heartbreaking image. A phone video from weeks before the incident shows Halia laughing with her cousins, leaning into her grandfather's shoulder, her smile wide and genuine. She looks happy. She looks safe. She looks like a girl with her whole life ahead of her. The video freezes on her face, and then the image shifts. The same face now rests in a framed portrait on the prosecutor's table, surrounded by black robes and legal pads and evidence folders. The girl who once filled a room with laughter is now reduced to a photograph. A victim, a case number, a name read aloud in a courtroom where her voice will never be heard again. Brianna Berezini's life in Westerville, Ohio, looked like 1,000 other suburban teenage lives. She was a community college student balancing classes at Columbus State with a part-time job. Her days followed predictable routines. Wake up, go to work, attend class, come home. She lived with her mother and stepfather in a quiet neighborhood where porch lights glowed softly at night and driveways were lined with neatly parked cars. On paper, her life was stable, unremarkable, safe. She wasn't the kind of person you'd look at and think danger. She wasn't the kind of person who stood out in a crowd. She blended in, moved through her days without drawing attention, and to most people who knew her casually, she seemed like just another young woman trying to figure out her future. Her defense attorneys would later lean heavily on that image. They described her as a good kid, no criminal record, high school graduate, enrolled in college, working a job, responsible. They painted a picture of someone who goes to work, goes to school, and goes home. Someone who doesn't start trouble. Someone who avoids conflict whenever possible. And on the surface, that description wasn't false. Brianna had never been arrested. She had never been in serious trouble with the law. She had never been the kind of teenager who ended up in the principal's office or on a police report. She fit every stereotype of a girl who should never end up in a courtroom facing a judge. She didn't look like a violent offender. And that's exactly what made the case so complicated. But tucked into that seemingly innocent image was one crucial detail that would change everything. Brianna regularly carried a knife in her pocket. She told police it was a work knife, something she used at her job, and just happened to have on her. It wasn't meant to be a weapon, she insisted. It was a tool, something practical, something she carried without thinking about it. But a knife is a strange thing. It exists in a space between utility and violence. It can open a box or cut a life short. It can be forgotten in a pocket or pulled out in a moment of panic. And on the night of March 26, 2023, when Brianna walked into 161, carry out with drinks on her mind, that knife was resting just inches from her hand. A tool that could become a weapon in a single heartbeat. To understand what happened that night, you have to go back further. Back to when Brianna and Halia were still friends. Back when they shared secrets and stayed up late texting and knew every detail of each other's lives. They were inseparable once, best friends in the way that only teenage girls can be, where every inside joke feels sacred and every shared moment feels permanent. But something shifted. Sometime around September or October of 2022, the friendship collapsed. The exact reason depends on who you ask. Some say it was over a boy. Some say it was over betrayal. Some say it was just the natural drift that happens when people grow apart. But whatever the cause, the fallout wasn't quiet. It wasn't a gentle fade. It was bitter. It was full of blocked numbers and whispered accusations and resentment that festered in silence. Brianna's version of the breakup painted Halia as the villain. In her police interview, she described Halia as someone who had changed, someone who had become a bad person. She said Halia went crazy. She said Halia threatened to hurt her and her boyfriend, that she talked about slashing tires and showing up at her house. Brianna framed herself as the target, the one under threat, the one who had every reason to be afraid. And maybe she was afraid. Maybe those threats were real, or maybe fear and anger got tangled up in her mind until she couldn't tell the difference anymore. Either way, Brianna began to see Halia not as a former friend, but as a looming danger, a someone she might one day have to defend herself against. And that framing became the backbone of everything that followed. It became the story she told herself, the story she told her lawyers, the story she would try to tell a jury. Emotionally, Brianna was building a case in her mind long before she ever stepped into a courtroom. She wasn't just carrying a knife. She was carrying a narrative, a script where she was the victim and Halia was the aggressor, and a version of events where anything she did in self-defense would be justified. And that narrative is dangerous because it gives permission. It turns violence from something unthinkable into something necessary. It allows a person to rehearse scenarios in their head until the imagined confrontation feels inevitable. And when the real confrontation finally came, Brianna didn't hesitate. She didn't freeze. She didn't run. She reached for the knife. Because in her mind, she had already decided what she would do. The text messages she sent in the days before the stabbing revealed just how far that mindset had gone. She wrote that she would slice Halia if she came near her. She wrote that she would cut her if she showed up at her family's home. These weren't vague statements. They were specific. They were violent. And they were written with clarity, not in the heat of a fight, but in the quiet of her own space where she had time to think, to type, to send. Those messages would later become the most damaging evidence against her, because they showed premeditation. They showed intent. They showed that when Brianna put that knife in her pocket on March 26th, it wasn't just a random decision. It was preparation. Whether she consciously admitted it to herself or not, she was ready for violence. The chapter ends on a moment of foreshadowing that feels almost too tragic to believe. On the evening of March 26th, Brianna gets into her friend's car. They're going to drive around, maybe grab some drinks, do what teenagers do on a Sunday night when they're bored and looking for something to fill the hours. Brianna slips the knife into her pocket without thinking. Just a habit, just something she carries from work. She has no idea that by the time she comes home, her clothes will be soaked in blood. She has no idea that police will be waiting at her door. She has no idea that the word murder is about to be attached to her name. She's just a suburban girl with a clean record and a knife in her pocket, heading toward a parking lot where two lives will collide and only one will walk away. It's Sunday night, March 26, 2023. Around 8:45 in the evening, Brianna's friend picks her up from her house in Westerville. The night is cool and quiet, the kind of evening where nothing feels urgent or dangerous. They drive through suburban streets with no particular destination in mind, just two teenagers doing what teenagers do, talking, listening to music, letting the hours drift by without purpose or plan. There's no tension in the car, no sense that the night will end in tragedy. It's just another forgettable Sunday that should fade into the background of memory like 1,000 others before it. But this night won't fade. And this night will be replayed in courtrooms and news reports and family nightmares for years to come. Throughout the evening, Brianna keeps her brother on the phone. It's a protective sibling dynamic that feels sweet and normal. He wants to keep an ear on his younger sister to make sure she's safe, to be there if anything goes wrong. Their call continues as the hours pass, a quiet thread of connection that makes Brianna feel watched over and secure. Around 11:30 at night, they decide they want drinks, not alcohol, just sodas or energy drinks or whatever sounds good in the moment. They head toward their usual spot, a place they've been to dozens of times before. 161 Carry Out, a smoke shop and convenience store on Emporium Square. It's the kind of place that stays open late, where the fluorescent lights buzz softly and the aisles are narrow and cluttered with snacks and beverages and vape products. It's familiar, it's safe, or at least it should be. Brianna walks into the store around 11:45, still on the phone with her brother, scanning the shelves for something to drink. The air inside smells like cleaning solution and artificial cherry flavoring. A few other customers move through the aisles, their faces lit by the harsh overhead lights. Brianna doesn't notice them at first. She's focused on her own task, her own conversation, her own small world. But then she hears voices. Familiar voices. Voices that belong to people she knows don't like her. Her body tenses. Her heart rate spikes. She looks up and sees them. Halia and her friends are already inside the store. The tension that's been building for months suddenly condenses into one narrow aisle and a few seconds of eye contact. This isn't a surprise meeting. This is a collision that both sides have been dreading and maybe, on some level, expecting. From Brianna's later statement to police, the confrontation starts with Halia. She frames it as an unprovoked attack, an aggressive move by someone who's been threatening her for weeks. But Halia's brother tells a very different story. He tells police that Brianna called Halia a cokehead inside the store, right there in front of everyone, loud enough for people to hear, direct enough that there's no mistaking the intent. It's a public attack on Halia's sobriety, on her recovery, on the most vulnerable part of her identity. And it lands like a bomb. Halia's brother explains why the insult is so devastating. Halia is a recovering addict. She's been fighting every single day to stay clean. And Brianna, someone who used to be her best friend, someone who knows exactly what that word means to her, throws it in her face like a weapon. The insult isn't just cruel. It's calculated. It's designed to humiliate. It's the kind of thing you say when you want to hurt someone in the deepest way possible. Halia takes it as a great offense. And who could blame her? This isn't just name-calling. This is an attack on her character, her progress, her entire sense of self-worth. The brother's words echo in the courtroom later. She called Halia out on being a cokehead, so she took that into great offense. It's the kind of moment that transforms hurt into rage in seconds. The kind of moment where pride and pain collide and rational thinking shuts down completely. Halia doesn't walk away. She doesn't let it slide. She reacts. And once that reaction starts, there's no easy way to stop it. Store staff sense the danger immediately. They've seen fights before. They know the signs, raised voices, tense postures, the shift in energy that happens right before things turn physical. An employee steps in and tells Halia and her friends to leave. They're escorted toward the door, the staff trying desperately to prevent a fight inside the store. It's a reasonable intervention. Get them separated, get them outside. Let them cool off. But the intervention only delays the inevitable, because teenage pride doesn't cool off that easily. Social dynamics don't reset just because an adult tells you to walk away. Halia is humiliated. She's been publicly shamed in front of her friends, and walking away now would feel like defeat. So she doesn't leave. She waits. Right outside the glass doors of 161, carry out, shoulders squared, adrenaline pumping, and friends gathering around her with phones already out and recording. Inside the store, Brianna finishes paying for her drinks. She knows what's waiting for her outside. She can see the shapes moving through the glass. She can hear the voices rising in volume. She has a choice in this moment. She could ask the staff to call the police. She could wait inside until things calm down. She could ask for an escort to her car. But she doesn't do any of those things. Maybe it's pride. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's the belief that backing down will make things worse. Or maybe, on some level, she's already decided what she's going to do. The knife is in her pocket. The threats she made days earlier are still sitting in her text messages. And the confrontation she's been imagining is about to become real. She takes a breath, holds her drinks, and walks toward the door. The chapter closes on that frozen moment. Brianna's hand reaching for the door handle, on the fluorescent lights of the store behind her. the darkness of the parking lot ahead. Halia waiting just beyond the glass, fists clenched, voice raised, ready for a fight that everyone assumes will be over in minutes, with nothing worse than bruises and hurt feelings. The audio from outside is already recording. The surveillance cameras are already rolling. And in less than 3 minutes, one of them will be bleeding out while the other is running for her life. The door opens. The night air rushes in, and everything that happens next will be captured on video, time-stamped, saved, and played back in a courtroom where a judge will decide who was the victim and who was the criminal. At 11:48 in the evening, Brianna and her friend push through the glass doors of 161 Carry Out. The surveillance camera mounted above the entrance captures every second. Brianna is holding drinks in her hands, all walking with her friend toward the car parked across the lot. For a split second, it looks like they might make it, like they might just get in the vehicle and drive away and let the whole thing dissolve into nothing. But Halia doesn't let that happen. She moves in fast, closing the distance between them with purpose and fury. Her voice cuts through the night air, sharp and loud, demanding attention. The confrontation that started inside the store is now spilling out into the open. And everyone in that parking lot knows what's about to happen. Or at least, they think they do. The background audio captures voices that will later haunt the courtroom. Male voices hyping up the moment, treating it like entertainment, like something to film and share and laugh about later. One voice asks, "Where's she at, bro?" Another responds, "Outside." And then, chillingly, someone yells directly at Halia, "Helia, crunch your blank, get it over with, shabro." The crowd is expecting a fist fight. They're expecting drama, hair-pulling, shoving, the kind of altercation that happens in parking lots and school hallways and house parties where people throw punches and then get separated and everyone goes home with stories to tell. No one in that crowd thinks they're about to witness a stabbing. No one thinks the night will end with police tape and bloodstains and a family burying their daughter. Brianna begins to back away. She's moving in reverse, holding her drinks, telling Halia she doesn't want to fight. Her voice is audible on the recording, rising in pitch, repeating the same phrases over and over. "Back up. I don't want to fight you. Just leave me alone." The defense will later count every single step she takes backward. 30 steps, 35, 40, maybe even 45. They'll argue that she's retreating, that she's trying to de-escalate, that she's doing everything a person is supposed to do when they're trying to avoid violence. And in those first seconds, that's exactly what it looks like. A girl backing away from a fight she didn't start. A girl trying to put distance between herself and danger. A girl who looks terrified and desperate and cornered. But Halia doesn't stop. She keeps advancing, yelling, arms swinging. Halia's brother will later admit to police that he didn't even see a knife get pulled at first. He thought it was going to be just a fight, a normal teenage altercation that would be over in seconds. He was there to step in between them if it got too serious, to pull his sister back before anyone got hurt. But the video shows something more complicated than a simple fistfight. It shows Brianna's hand moving, a glint of metal catching the parking lot lights, the knife coming out of her pocket in one smooth motion, like she's done it before. It's like she's thought about this exact scenario in her mind, and even after the knife is visible, even after the blade is out in the open where everyone can see it, Halia doesn't stop. She keeps pushing forward, driven by anger and adrenaline and the kind of tunnel vision that shuts down rational thought. Despite seeing the knife, Halia keeps striking. Her fists connect with Brianna's arms, her shoulders, her head. She's undeterred by the weapon, maybe because she doesn't fully process the danger, or maybe because pride won't let her back down now. Her friends are still yelling. The phones are still recording. The energy in the parking lot is still pitched at the level of spectacle, not tragedy. The narrator stresses the tragic blindness on both sides. Halia can't see that this is no longer just a fight. Brianna can't see that pulling a knife has escalated everything beyond repair. Both of them are locked into a collision course that neither one knows how to exit. And the crowd around them, the people who could intervene, who could step in and stop this before it goes too far, they choose recording over action. They preserve perfect evidence at the cost of prevention. One of Brianna's friends tries to step between them, a last-ditch effort to physically separate the two girls before someone gets seriously hurt. But a male voice from Halia's group immediately warns him off. "If you touch my sister, I'm going to have to put my phone down." Bro. It's a threat wrapped in a joke wrapped in a recording. The message is clear. Don't interfere. Let them handle it. Keep filming. The crowd has chosen their role. They're observers, documentarians, witnesses who will later say they didn't think it was that serious, that they didn't know anyone had a knife, that everything happened so fast they couldn't process it in real time. But the video doesn't lie. The video shows plenty of time, plenty of space, plenty of opportunity for someone to shout stop loud enough to break the spell. But no one does. Then, in one frantic stabbing motion, Brianna swings the knife. The blade enters just below Halia's clavicle, cutting into the soft tissue of her neck and chest. It's a single strike, but it's placed in one of the most dangerous areas of the human body. The kind of wound that can sever arteries, collapse lungs, cause someone to bleed out in minutes. But the fight doesn't stop immediately. Halia keeps grabbing at Brianna, still dragging her by the hair, still functioning on shock and rage and adrenaline. Brianna pulls away, stumbling backward, breathing hard, not yet understanding what she's done. Both girls are still moving, still yelling, still locked in the aftermath of violence that hasn't fully registered in either of their minds. The crowd is still filming. The parking lot is still lit by the same fluorescent glow. And for a few surreal seconds, it looks like just another fight that will end with both girls going home, bruised and angry, but alive. The chapter ends with that horrifying moment of separation. The fight breaks apart. Brianna heads toward her car, hands shaking, believing she might be the one who's hurt. Halia walks toward her Jeep with her friends, her hand pressed vaguely to her chest. She sits down in the driver's seat. And only then does someone notice the blood. Not a trickle, not a stain, but blood shooting from her chest in rhythmic spurts that match her heartbeat. Someone screams her name. The phones that were pointed at the fight now turn toward the Jeep, and in that instant the night transforms from entertainment into emergency, from a story they'll tell tomorrow into a tragedy that will define the rest of their lives. As Halia sits in the passenger seat of the Jeep, one of her friends leans in to check on her and freezes. Blood is spitting from her chest in violent, pulsing streams, not a slow leak, not something that can be covered with a hand or a tissue. This is arterial bleeding, the kind that means something catastrophic has been severed inside. The friend's voice cracks as she screams Halia's name, and suddenly the entire energy of the parking lot shifts. The laughter stops. The phones lower. The realization hits everyone at once like a wave of ice water. This wasn't just a fight. This was a stabbing. And Halia is dying right in front of them. People who were filming seconds ago are now scrambling, shouting for help, calling 911, their voices overlapping in panic and confusion. Halia's brother rushes to her side, his mind racing back to memories he's spent years trying to forget. In his later statement to police, his voice breaks as he describes ripping off his shirt and pressing it hard against the wound, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. He's done this before. He's held people he loves while they bled out in his arms. He's felt the helplessness of watching life slip away, despite everything he does to hold it in. He tells investigators that his brothers died in his arms because they got shot, and he didn't put pressure on the wounds fast enough. He's haunted by that failure, and now, in this parking lot, with his sister's blood soaking through his shirt, he's living that nightmare all over again. He presses harder. He begs her to stay awake. Oh, he tells her help is coming. But deep down, he knows the clock is already ticking down. The sensory chaos of the scene is overwhelming. Flashing lights from passing cars reflect off the wet pavement. People are screaming Halia's name, crying, shouting conflicting instructions. Someone dials 911 at 11:48, their voice shaking as they report a teenage girl stabbed outside 161 Carry Out. The operator asks questions, trying to assess the severity or trying to dispatch the right resources. But there's no easy way to describe what's happening. The blurred line between a crowded teenage hangout and an active crime scene makes everything feel surreal. One moment it was a fight. The next moment it's life and death. And everyone standing in that parking lot is struggling to process the speed at which everything fell apart. Columbus police arrive within minutes, their sirens cutting through the night. Officers step out into a scene of confusion and grief. Friends are crying. Relatives are yelling. People are pushing forward, trying to get to Halia, trying to see if she's okay, trying to do something, anything to help. The officers have to physically push the crowd back so paramedics can work. Body camera footage captures the desperation in the voices around them. Halia's sister is begging to get to her. Friends are screaming that she's bleeding too much. Someone keeps repeating, Please save my sister. Please save my sister." It's the kind of plea that cuts through all the noise and procedure and protocol, a raw human cry that no amount of training prepares you to hear without feeling it in your chest. Paramedics rush Halia to Ohio Health Riverside Medical Center, working on her in the back of the ambulance as the vehicle speeds through red lights and empty intersections. Trauma surgeons are already prepped and waiting when she arrives, their hands moving with practiced precision, trying to repair damage that few teenagers ever survive. While doctors work under bright surgical lights, detectives outside the hospital start piecing together the story from witnesses who are still shaking and crying and trying to make sense of what they saw. The information comes together quickly. This isn't a mystery. Everyone knows both girls. Everyone saw the fight. And within minutes, officers have Brianna's full name, her address in Westerville, her social media profiles, and a description of the car she left in. This isn't an unknown suspect or a faceless stranger. This is someone whose entire life can be mapped with a few phone calls. Crucially, one man's phone holds the raw video of the entire confrontation. He filmed from the moment Halia and Brianna came face to face outside the store until the moment the fight separated. Every second is captured. Every word is audible. Every movement is visible. Our officers immediately recognize the value of that footage and put the phone into airplane mode, a standard procedure to preserve digital evidence. No edits, no deletions, no accidental texts or calls that might overwrite data. The fight and the stabbing are now stamped into digital memory, time-coded and geotagged, ready to be analyzed frame by frame in a forensic lab and later projected onto courtroom screens where a jury will watch a girl's life end in real time. But the chapter closes with a stark time cut that feels like a punch to the gut. At 12:24 in the morning on March 27, 2023, doctors at Ohio Health Riverside Medical Center pronounce Halia Lynn Culbertson dead. They did everything they could. They fought for every second. But the wound was too deep, the blood loss too severe, the damage too catastrophic. She's gone. At almost the exact same moment, 20 minutes away in a different building, Brianna sits alone in a gray interrogation room. She doesn't know yet that Halia is dead. She doesn't know yet that the word murder has just been attached to her name. She's sitting under fluorescent lights with her arms wrapped around herself, waiting for someone to come in and tell her what happens next. And when that door finally opens, everything she thought she understood about that night is about to shatter. While Halia is dying in the trauma bay, Columbus police officers drive 20 minutes north to Westerville, a quiet suburban neighborhood where porch lights glow softly and lawns are neatly trimmed. The streets are silent at this hour, lined with houses where families are asleep, unaware that a few miles away, a teenager is fighting for her life. The officers pull up to a clean driveway and walk toward a house that looks like every other house on the block. Normal, safe, unremarkable. They knock on the door. I'm not sure what they'll find inside, but prepared for anything. When the door opens, they ask for Brianna Berezini, and within seconds, they realize something is off. Something about the scene doesn't match the chaos they just left behind in that parking lot. Brianna is calm when they find her. Too calm. She's not crying. She's not panicking. She's not pacing the living room or shaking with adrenaline. She's already showered, already changed out of the clothes she wore during the fight. And those clothes, the ones that would have blood on them, the ones that would carry forensic evidence of exactly what happened, are in the washing machine. Mid-cycle, soap and water already working to erase whatever traces might have been there. Prosecutors will later argue that this behavior shows consciousness of guilt, that an innocent person who acted purely in self-defense wouldn't immediately go home and destroy evidence. One that someone who truly believed they did nothing wrong wouldn't scrub their hands and hide their clothes before police even arrived. The narrator underscores the stark contrast between the two scenes playing out simultaneously. In one location, there's raw panic. Halia's family is in a hospital waiting room, holding each other, praying, crying, begging doctors for updates. Friends are being interviewed by police, their voices breaking as they describe what they saw. The parking lot of 161 Carryout is lit up with crime scene tape and floodlights, forensic technicians marking blood patterns on the asphalt. And in another location, 20 minutes away, there's a quiet suburban house where a teenager has just taken a shower and put her laundry in the wash. The juxtaposition is chilling. It's the difference between chaos and control, between reaction and calculation, between someone who doesn't understand what just happened and someone who understands exactly what just happened. Brianna does not resist arrest. She doesn't argue. She doesn't ask for a lawyer. She simply nods, allows the officers to handcuff her, and walks to the patrol car without saying a word. She's placed in the back seat, the door closing with a heavy metallic thunk that seals her into a space she's never been in before. The drive to police headquarters is silent. She stares out the window at streets she's driven down 1,000 times, but everything looks different now. The lights are harsher, the shadows are deeper. The weight of what's happening is starting to settle on her chest like a stone. She's driven to the downtown precinct and led into an interrogation room. Standard gray walls, a metal table, a chair bolted to the floor. And then she's left alone for hours. Sitting in that room, Brianna has nothing to do but wait and think. The adrenaline from the fight has faded, replaced by exhaustion and creeping dread. She replays the night in her mind, the insult, the confrontation, the backing away, the knife, the blood. She tells herself it was self-defense. She tells herself she had no choice. She tells herself that once she explains everything, once people see the video and hear about the threats Halia made, they'll understand. She'll go home. Maybe not tonight, but soon. She has to believe that. Because the alternative is too terrifying to process. The consequences of what just happened are still abstract to her. Halia is a name, a person, but not yet a body, not yet a death, not yet a murder charge. Brianna sits in that room believing she can still talk her way out of this. Then the door opens. A detective walks in carrying a folder and a weight in his expression that makes Brianna's stomach drop. He sits down across from her and doesn't waste time with small talk. He tells her plainly, without sugarcoating, that Halia was taken to the hospital, and she died. She didn't survive her injuries, and because of that, they're charging Brianna with murder. The word hangs in the air like a blade. Murder, not assault, not manslaughter. Murder. Brianna's face goes blank. Her mouth opens, but no sound comes out at first. And then, in a voice that sounds small and lost, she asks, It no sort of self-defense or anything? It's the question of someone who genuinely believed the law would protect her, someone who thought fear and retreat were enough to justify what she did. The detective's response is blunt and final. Self-defense can be argued later in court. That's for lawyers and judges to sort out. But tonight, right now, she's not going home. She's going to jail because they're charging her with murder. Brianna sits back in her chair, and the reality of the situation finally crashing down on her. She asks again, voice cracking, "I'm not going home?" And the detective shakes his head. "No, you're going to jail because we're charging you with murder." The narrator highlights this line as the first real crack in the armor of reassurance she's been clinging to. Up until this moment, she believed she'd be okay. She believed her clean record and her story would save her. But now, sitting in that gray room with handcuffs waiting on the table, she realizes that everything has changed. Her life as she knew it is over. The chapter ends with a simple visual, a courtroom calendar card overlay. March 27, 2023. Brianna Berezini formally charged with murder. It's a date that will be etched into two families' timelines forever. For Halia's family, it's the day they lost their daughter, the day the world stopped making sense, and the day every future plan and dream and hope turned to ash. For Brianna's family, it's the day their daughter became a defendant, the day their quiet suburban life imploded, the day they had to call a criminal defense attorney and start using words like arraignment and bond and plea deal. One single night, one single decision, and two families whose lives will never be the same. The next day, March 28, 2023, Brianna appears in Franklin County Municipal Court for her arraignment. She stands before the judge wearing jail-issued clothing, her hair pulled back, her face pale and exhausted. Next to her is her attorney, Robert Krapins, a defense lawyer who immediately begins crafting the narrative that will define the next year of legal battles. This is not murder, he insists. This is self-defense. This is a tragic situation where a young woman with no history of violence was forced to protect herself from an aggressive attacker. Krapins leans hard into Brianna's background, painting a picture designed to generate sympathy and reasonable doubt. No criminal record, college student, hard worker, someone who goes to school, goes to work, and goes home. Someone who doesn't start fights or look for trouble. Someone who, by every metric, I should never be standing in front of a judge facing a murder charge. Krapins frames Brianna as a victim caught in an impossible situation. He describes the months of alleged threats from Halia, the fear his client lived with daily, the constant worry that a confrontation was coming. And when that confrontation finally happened, he argues, Brianna did what any reasonable person would do. She tried to retreat. She backed away. She begged Halia to stop. And when none of that worked, when she was cornered and afraid and out of options, she defended herself. It's a compelling story. It's the kind of story that makes juries pause and reconsider, because self-defense is deeply embedded in American legal culture. The idea that you have a right to protect yourself when threatened. The idea that you shouldn't have to run or hide or let someone hurt you. And Ohio's Stand Your Ground law makes that argument even stronger, removing the duty to retreat in many situations. The judge listens to both sides and sets bond at $750,000. It's a significant amount, reflecting the gravity of the charge. Murder is not something judges take lightly, especially when the victim is a 17-year-old girl and the evidence includes video footage of the fatal encounter. But Brianna's family manages to post the bond. They pull together resources, likely through a bail bondsman, and within days, Brianna walks out of jail under strict conditions. No contact with Halia's family or friends, no weapons of any kind, no visits to the crime scene or anywhere near 161 carryout. She's fitted with an ankle monitor and sent home to wait for trial. And that waiting period, That liminal space between arrest and resolution becomes its own kind of torture for everyone involved. To Halia's family, the fact that the girl who killed their daughter is back home, living something resembling a normal life, is a wound that cuts deeper every single day. They see photos of Brianna on social media. They hear updates from friends about sightings around town. They know she's sleeping in her own bed, eating meals with her family, attending classes online, moving through the routines of daily life. Meanwhile, Halia is in a cemetery. Her room is empty. Her chair at the dinner table is vacant. Her voice is gone. The asymmetry feels unbearable. How can someone take a life and then just go home? How can the legal system allow that? The answer is complicated, rooted in the presumption of innocence and the constitutional right to bail. But to a grieving family, those legal principles feel like betrayal. Months begin to stretch into a year. Court dates get postponed. Motions are filed. Discovery is exchanged. The legal machinery grinds forward at a pace that feels glacial to everyone waiting for resolution. Both sides spend this time building their cases, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, preparing for a trial that will determine Brianna's future and, in some symbolic way, deliver justice for Halia. The defense collects every detail that supports their self-defense claim. Videos showing Halia advancing aggressively, witness statements about her anger and threats, a documentation of Brianna's retreat, the slap that landed before the knife came out. Every piece of evidence that can paint Brianna as a frightened girl who had no choice. Meanwhile, the prosecution builds a very different picture. A picture of escalating intent, of prior threats, of a young woman who carried a knife and used it not as a last resort, but as a solution she had already imagined. The legal tug-of-war centers on Ohio's self-defense framework. The law is clear in theory, but messy in application. A person has the right to defend themselves if they reasonably believe they're in imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm. They can use force, even deadly force, if that belief is reasonable. And in Ohio, there's no duty to retreat if you're in a place you have a legal right to be. Brianna was legally in that parking lot. She wasn't trespassing. She wasn't somewhere she shouldn't have been. So on paper, the law seems to support her. But there's a catch. The force used must be proportionate to the threat, and that's where the case gets complicated. Can a person who brought a knife, who exchanged insults, who sent threatening texts days earlier, claim they had no choice but to stab an unarmed girl in the neck? That's the question a jury will have to answer. Beneath all the legal language, there's a psychological dimension that's harder to quantify, but just as important. Brianna appears to genuinely believe her own narrative. In interviews, in statements, in her demeanor, she presents as someone who sees herself as a victim. She talks about never starting fights, about backing away from confrontation, about being afraid, and it's possible she truly feels that way. Human psychology is complicated. We're all the heroes of our own stories. We all find ways to justify our actions, to frame our choices in the most sympathetic light. Brianna has built a self-image around being nonviolent, and she holds on to that image tightly even as the evidence begins to tell a different story. The question isn't whether she believes it. The question is whether a jury will. The chapter ends on a line that hasn't been made public yet, but sits waiting in the prosecutor's file like a loaded weapon. A text message sent by Brianna roughly a week before the stabbing. A message where she writes, "I'd sooner slice Culbertson's blank if she comes near me again." Those words are about to become the single most damaging piece of evidence in the case, because they show that Brianna didn't just react in the moment. She thought about violence. She typed it out. She sent it to friends. She imagined cutting Halia days before it actually happened. And once a jury sees those words, every frame of her backing away in that parking lot will look different. It won't look like fear. It will look like preparation. As investigators dig deeper into Brianna's phone records and social media accounts, they uncover messages she never mentioned in her initial interviews. These aren't casual texts. These aren't vague complaints about a former friend. These are explicit, violent threats sent about a week before the fatal encounter. The kind of messages that prosecutors dream about finding, because they transform a self-defense claim into something much darker. On the screen in the courtroom, projected large enough for everyone to see, the narrator reveals one of the most damning lines. "I'd sooner slice Culbertson's blank if she comes near me again, and I will cut that blank on my whole family if she tries showing up to my family's home again." The words are clear. The intent is unmistakable. And suddenly, Brianna's insistence that she never starts fights collides head-on with hard evidence of violent ideation. These messages are a prosecution goldmine because they show premeditation. Not in the legal sense of planning a murder weeks in advance, but in the psychological sense of already imagining and articulating a violent response. Brianna wasn't just theoretically afraid of Halia. She was actively thinking about cutting her. She was talking about it with friends. She was putting the thought into words and sending it out into the world where it would be saved on servers and screenshots and digital records that can't be taken back. The defense will argue these are just words, the kind of angry venting teenagers do when they're upset and don't really mean it. But the prosecution sees something else entirely. They see evidence that when Brianna put that knife in her pocket on March 26th, it wasn't a random coincidence. It was preparation for a scenario she had already played out in her mind. From the state's perspective, these texts are the key that unlocks the entire case. They allow prosecutors to argue that Brianna wasn't simply reacting in fear when she stabbed Halia. She was executing a plan she had already verbalized. The legal term is prior bad acts or evidence of intent, and it's exactly the kind of thing that can sway a jury from sympathy to conviction. Because jurors are human. They understand fear. They understand self-defense. They can imagine backing away from a fight and feeling cornered. But when they read a text message where someone writes about slicing another person days before actually doing it, that understanding evaporates. It stops looking like panic and starts looking like a threat fulfilled. It stops being about defense and starts being about aggression dressed up as victimhood. Defense attorneys see these messages and immediately recognize the danger. This is the kind of evidence that can destroy a sympathetic narrative in seconds. Robert Crappens knows that once a jury reads "Slice Culbertson" in Brianna's own words, every other piece of evidence will be filtered through that lens. The video of her backing away won't look like retreat. It will look like someone creating distance before using a weapon they already plan to use. The claims of fear won't sound genuine, they'll sound like convenient excuses. And the self-defense argument, which seemed so strong when it was just about the parking lot confrontation, will crumble under the weight of those premeditated threats. Crappens has a decision to make: fight to keep the texts out of trial, or prepare for the uphill battle of explaining them away. In the months leading up to trial, the prosecution's theory crystallizes into three clear pillars. First, excessive force. Halia was unarmed. She slapped and shoved, which are assaultive behaviors, but they don't justify a knife to the clavicle. The law requires proportionality. You can meet force with force, but you can't escalate to deadly force unless you're facing deadly force. A slap is not deadly force. A shove is not deadly force. A knife to the neck absolutely is. Second, post-incident behavior. Fleeing the scene, showering immediately, washing clothes, hiding the weapon. These are actions that suggest consciousness of guilt. An innocent person calls 911. An innocent person waits for police. An innocent person preserves evidence because they have nothing to hide. Brianna did the opposite. The third pillar is the most powerful: prior threats. The text messages showing she envisioned violence against Halia in advance. This isn't about what happened in the parking lot. This is about what was happening in Brianna's mind days before the parking lot. It's about the narrative she was building, the justification she was rehearsing, the violence she was already imagining. When you combine all three pillars, the prosecution has a story that's hard to argue against. A young woman who threatened violence, carried a weapon, used excessive force, and then tried to cover it up. That's not self-defense, that's murder, or at the very least, manslaughter. And the state is prepared to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense counters with their own narrative, focusing relentlessly on the video. They stress that Halia was waiting outside the store, that she initiated the physical confrontation, that she kept advancing even after the knife was visible. They invoke Ohio's Stand Your Ground law, arguing that Brianna had no duty to retreat, even though she did. They point to witness statements confirming that Halia struck first. They emphasize Brianna's lack of criminal history, her youth, her otherwise law-abiding life. They try to humanize her, trying to make the jury see a scared college student, not a cold-blooded killer. But every time they make that argument, the prosecution has a response ready. And that response is always the same. Read the text messages. Look at what she wrote. Look at what she was already planning to do. Words don't lie. The chapter ends on a pretrial tension point that feels like the calm before a storm. Both sides are gearing up for a highly publicized trial. The courtroom is already reserved. A jury selection is scheduled. Witnesses are being prepped. Media outlets are requesting access. This is the kind of case that will dominate local news for weeks. A young defendant, a young victim, video evidence, competing narratives about self-defense and murder. It has all the elements of a dramatic legal battle. But there's one more motion that needs to be resolved before trial can begin. The defense has filed to exclude the text messages, arguing they're too prejudicial. That they'll inflame the jury and prevent a fair trial. The judge will have to decide, and that decision will determine whether Brianna faces a jury who sees her as a frightened girl or a calculated killer. The entire case hinges on that ruling. As June 2024 approaches, the courthouse prepares for what promises to be a dramatic and highly publicized trial. Jury selection is scheduled to begin. Witnesses have been subpoenaed, and the prosecution and defense teams have spent months building their cases, rehearsing opening statements, preparing exhibits. The video footage has been edited into clips that will be played and replayed for jurors. Halia's family has steeled themselves for the emotional ordeal of sitting through testimony, watching their daughter's final moments projected on a screen, listening to strangers dissect the night she died. Brianna's family has done the same, are preparing to hear their daughter described as a murderer, knowing that every word spoken in that courtroom could determine whether she comes home or spends years behind bars. But before any of that can happen, there's one crucial pretrial motion that could reshape the entire playing field. Robert Krapins files a motion asking Judge Mark Serrett to exclude the threatening text messages from trial. His argument is straightforward. Those messages, written days before the stabbing, would unfairly prejudice the jury against his client. They would inflame emotions and overshadow the actual dynamics of the fight. The jury's job is to determine whether Brianna acted in self-defense in that parking lot on that specific night, not to judge her based on angry words she typed in a moment of frustration a week earlier. Krapins argues that the probative value of the texts is outweighed by their prejudicial impact. In other words, they don't prove anything about what actually happened during the confrontation, but they would absolutely poison the jury's perception of Brianna before the trial even really begins. It's a legally sound argument. Judges exclude evidence all the time when it's more inflammatory than informative. The prosecution pushes back with equal force. Assistant prosecutors argue that the text messages are not background noise. They're not irrelevant venting. They are central to understanding Brianna's mindset and intent. They show that she wasn't simply reacting in panic when she stabbed Halia. She had already framed Halia as someone she might need to cut if confronted. She had already verbalized that violence. She had already crossed the psychological line from fear to action in her own mind. The texts prove that when Brianna walked into that parking lot with a knife in her pocket, it wasn't coincidence. It was preparation. And preparation speaks directly to intent, which is the core question in any murder or manslaughter case. The state insists that without those messages, the jury would have an incomplete and misleading picture of what really happened. In a pretrial hearing, Judge Serrett listens carefully to both sides. He weighs the legal standards that govern admissibility. Evidence must be relevant, meaning it has a tendency to make a fact more or less probable. The texts are clearly relevant to intent. But evidence can be excluded if its prejudicial impact substantially outweighs its probative value. That's the balance judges have to strike. Will the jury be able to hear about these texts and still fairly evaluate the self-defense claim? Or will the texts dominate their thinking and prevent them from focusing on what actually happened in the parking lot? It's a difficult call, and the judge knows that whichever way he rules, it will likely determine the outcome of the trial. Exclude the texts, and the defense has a real chance. Include them, and the prosecution's case becomes nearly unbeatable. Judge Serrett makes his ruling. The text messages will be allowed at trial. He finds that they are relevant to the question of intent and that their probative value is not substantially outweighed by prejudice. But he doesn't sugarcoat the impact. He openly cautions Brianna and her attorney that the messages will not help their case. It's an understated judicial warning that carries enormous weight. The judge is essentially saying, you have the right to go to trial, but you should understand that this evidence is going to be devastating. It's the kind of moment where defense attorneys have to have a very serious conversation with their clients. Do we proceed knowing the jury will see those texts? Or do we reconsider our strategy entirely? Because once those words are read aloud in open court, there's no taking them back. The jury will never unhear them. With that ruling in place, Krapinch and Brianna face a brutal calculation. They can go forward with a jury trial where Brianna's own words about slicing Halia will be blown up on courtroom screens and read aloud by a prosecutor who will emphasize every violent syllable. The jury will see the video of her backing away, but they'll also know she had already threatened to cut Halia days earlier. They'll hear her claim of fear, but they'll also read texts that sound more like aggression than self-preservation. And if the jury convicts her of murder, she's looking at 15 years to life in prison. That's the gamble. Or they can accept a plea deal, admit to a lesser charge, take a guaranteed sentence that's far shorter than what a murder conviction would bring. It's not an easy choice. Accepting a plea means giving up the chance of acquittal. It means admitting guilt. It means having a felony conviction on her record forever. That same afternoon, with jurors already assembled in a waiting room down the hall, Krapinch and Brianna make their decision. They will accept a plea deal. They will admit to involuntary manslaughter instead of risking a murder conviction. It's a pragmatic choice driven by the reality of the evidence. The texts are too damaging. The risk is too high. And while a manslaughter plea means prison time, and it also means a cap on how long that prison time can be. The maximum sentence for involuntary manslaughter in Ohio is 3 years. Compare that to 15 years to life for murder, and the choice becomes clearer. It's not about innocence or guilt anymore. It's about damage control. It's about choosing the least worst option in a situation where there are no good options left. The chapter ends with a quiet but pivotal scene. The judge's bench is covered in paperwork. A guilty plea form sits in front of Brianna, lines waiting for her signature. Krapinch leans over and walks her through each section, making sure she understands what she's agreeing to. She's admitting that she caused Halia's death through reckless actions. She's giving up her right to a trial. She's accepting that she will be convicted today and sentenced later. She picks up the pen. Her hand hesitates for just a moment, and then she signs. It's a sudden pivot from months of insisting, "I acted in self-defense," to a formal legal admission that she killed someone. The murder trial that was supposed to dominate the news for weeks is over before it even begins. And now the only question left is how many years she'll spend in prison. In open court, with Halia's family seated in the rows behind the prosecution table and Brianna's family seated on the opposite side, Judge Serrett confirms the details of the plea agreement. It's a 3-page document that both sides have reviewed and signed. Brianna is pleading guilty to involuntary manslaughter, a third-degree felony under Ohio law. The maximum sentence is 3 years in prison, along with a possible fine of up to $10,000. The judge's voice is measured and formal as he walks through the legal requirements of accepting a guilty plea. He needs to ensure that Brianna understands what she's doing, that she's making this decision voluntarily, that no one has coerced or threatened her into signing. This is not a negotiation. This is not a provisional agreement. This is a final, binding admission that will result in a conviction today and a permanent criminal record for the rest of her life. Judge Serrett asks Brianna directly if she signed the form and if she understands the charge. She stands, her voice quiet but clear, and answers, "Yes, Your Honor." He asks if she understands that by pleading guilty, she is giving up her right to a trial, her right to confront witnesses, her right to make the state prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Again, she answers yes. He asks if anyone has promised her anything beyond what's written in the plea agreement, or if anyone has threatened her to get her to plead guilty. She shakes her head and says no. It's a procedural ritual, but it's an important one. The judge is creating a record that will prevent her from later claiming she didn't understand what she was agreeing to or that she was pressured into the plea. Every answer she gives closes another door behind her. The narrator explains the legal meaning of involuntary manslaughter in this context. Under Ohio law, it means causing another person's death as a result of committing or attempting to commit a misdemeanor, or as a proximate result of reckless behavior. In Brianna's case, the plea acknowledges that she caused Halia's death through reckless actions during a sudden emotional confrontation. It's not an admission that she intended to kill Halia or that she planned the stabbing in advance. It's an admission that she acted recklessly, that she used a knife in a way that created an unjustifiable risk, and that her actions directly resulted in a death. It's a middle ground between murder and accident. It says, I didn't plan this, but I'm responsible for what happened. And for the purposes of the legal system, that's enough to warrant punishment. With that plea entered, the murder trial ends before it begins. There will be no jury selection, no opening statements, no parade of witnesses taking the stand to describe what they saw that night, no cross-examination of Brianna's friends or Halia's brother, no forensic experts explaining blood spatter patterns or wound trajectories, no playing and replaying of the parking lot video while jurors take notes, no dramatic closing arguments where attorneys appeal to justice and mercy and the weight of reasonable doubt. All of that evaporates in an instant. The courtroom that was prepared for weeks of testimony will instead move directly to sentencing. The only question left is how much time Brianna will serve, and that decision rests entirely with Judge Serrett. For Halia's family, the plea is devastating in a way that's hard to articulate. They had steeled themselves for a full trial. They were ready to sit through the pain of reliving that night in excruciating detail. They were prepared to hear Brianna's defense team try to paint their daughter as the aggressor, to hear lawyers argue that Halia brought this on herself. They were ready for all of it because they believed a trial would shine a harsh, unforgiving light on every second of what happened. They believed a jury would see the truth and deliver a murder conviction. But now, with the plea, the charge is lowered. The potential sentence is capped at 3 years. 3 years for a life, 3 years for a daughter, a granddaughter, a sister, a friend. To them, it feels impossibly, unbearably light. Her grandfather, Harley Langley, and grandmother, Vicky Cashdollar, have been vocal in the media about their heartbreak. They speak openly about the empty chair at family dinners, share the holidays that will never be the same, the future that was stolen. They talk about Halia's laugh, her recovery, her strength, and the cruel injustice that the person who killed her might be free in just a few years. 3 years is a tiny fraction of the decades they'll spend without her. 3 years doesn't come close to matching the permanence of death. And while they understand the legal reasoning behind the plea, the pragmatic calculation that the texts made a murder conviction uncertain, none of that understanding makes the outcome feel like justice. To them, no amount of prison time will ever be enough. But 3 years feels especially inadequate. From the prosecution's standpoint, the plea is a strategic win. It guarantees a conviction without the risk of a jury trial. And that risk was real. Juries are unpredictable. Self-defense cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute because they hinge on subjective questions about fear and reasonableness. Or even with the damaging text messages, there was video showing Brianna backing away. There were witnesses who saw Halia advance and strike first. A sympathetic defense attorney could have framed Brianna as a scared young woman who made a tragic mistake in a moment of terror. And if even one juror believed that story strongly enough, it could result in a hung jury or an outright acquittal. The plea eliminates that risk. It ensures that Brianna will be convicted, that she will serve time, and that Halia's death will be officially recognized as a criminal act. It's not perfect, but in the messy reality of the justice system, it's a solid outcome. The chapter closes with a date card projected on the courtroom screen. Sentencing set for July 11th, 2024. The words hang in the air with a weight that everyone in the room feels. Brianna sits back down after her plea, her expression carefully guarded, her hands folded in her lap. She's avoided the possibility of life in prison. She's avoided the public spectacle of a trial. But she hasn't avoided accountability. She will be sentenced. She will go to prison. The only question now is for how long, and that answer will come in just a few weeks when the same courtroom fills again and a judge speaks the numbers that will define the next chapter of two families' lives. On July 11th, 2024, the courtroom is packed again. This time, there's no question of guilt. And Brianna has already admitted responsibility for Halia's death. The plea has been entered, the conviction recorded. The only issue before the court is punishment. Judge Serrett has the authority to sentence Brianna to anywhere from probation with no prison time up to the maximum of 3 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter. Both sides know this is their final opportunity to influence that decision. The prosecution will argue for the maximum. The defense will argue for leniency. And somewhere in the middle of those competing narratives, the judge will have to find a number that represents justice. Whatever he decides will shape how this case is remembered, whether it's seen as accountability or as a failure of the system to adequately punish someone who took a life. Assistant Prosecutor Trenton Groy speaks first, standing before the judge with a calm but resolute demeanor. He begins by acknowledging something that many prosecutors might try to ignore. He admits that the evidence shows some elements consistent with self-defense. Halia was aggressive that night. She waited outside the store. She approached Brianna. She initiated the physical confrontation. She struck first. These are facts that can't be disputed, and Groy doesn't try to dispute them. He's building credibility with the judge by showing he's not blind to the complexity of the case. But then he pivots to the central argument that will define his entire presentation. None of those actions, he says, justify what Brianna did next. None of them justify taking a knife and plunging it into Halia's clavicle. Groy's voice carries a controlled intensity as he frames the moral core of the case. That is an act of unjustifiable rage. A stabbing is a disproportionate response to a slap. He lets that sentence hang in the air for a moment, giving it time to settle. The word rage is carefully chosen. It reframes the stabbing from a panicked defensive act into an emotional explosion that crossed every line. He continues, emphasizing that many people have been slapped, provoked, insulted, even assaulted in their lives, and the overwhelming majority of them do not respond by stabbing someone near the neck. That escalation, that choice to use deadly force against an unarmed person, is what transforms a confrontation into a homicide. It's what makes this a crime, not just a tragedy. And it's why Brianna deserves the maximum sentence. Then the defense takes its turn. Robert Krapinch rises and asks the court's permission to play portions of the surveillance video one more time. The screen lights up with grainy footage from outside 161 Carryout. Krapinch narrates as the video plays, walking the judge through each movement. Brianna emerges from the store holding drinks. Posters on the glass door partially obscure her view of what's outside. She doesn't see Halia waiting until it's too late. The confrontation begins, and then critically, Brianna starts backing away. Krapinch counts the steps aloud as the video plays. 1, 2, 5, 10, 15. He emphasizes that she takes no less than 30 steps backwards, trying to create distance, trying to avoid the fight. And even after she pulls the knife, she takes roughly 15 more steps in reverse. She's not charging forward. She's not pursuing. She's retreating the entire time. Krapinch argues that this is not mutual combat. This is an assault on his client. Brianna is the one being chased. Brianna is the one being struck. Brianna is the one repeatedly asking Halia to back off and being ignored. He underscores her fear, painting a picture of a young woman who was terrified, outnumbered, and cornered. He reminds the judge that when Brianna's friend tried to step in and help, one of Halia's friends threatened him, warning him not to touch Halia or he'd have to put his phone down and get involved physically. That threat, Krapinch argues, reinforced Brianna's sense that she was alone, that no one was going to help her, that she had to protect herself or risk serious injury. He frames the stabbing not as rage, but as desperation, a last resort from someone who saw no other way out. The courtroom sits in tense silence as both narratives settle. On one side, unjustifiable rage, a calculated, excessive response that turned a slap into a killing. On the other side, a terrified girl backing away with a knife, afraid and alone, acting out of fear rather than malice. Both stories are built on the same set of facts, the same video, the same witness statements. But they lead to completely different conclusions. One asks for maximum punishment, the other asks for mercy. And somewhere in that space between rage and fear, between accountability and compassion, and Judge Serrett will have to decide which version of events deserves more weight. The prosecutor sees a girl who brought a knife and used it when she didn't have to. The defense sees a girl who tried everything else first and only used the knife when she felt she had no choice. The emotional tension in the courtroom is palpable. Halia's family sits with expressions carved from grief and anger. They've heard the defense's argument before. They've heard the counting of steps, the emphasis on retreat, the framing of their daughter as the aggressor. And none of it changes the fact that Halia is dead. None of it changes the reality that she was unarmed, that a knife to the neck is not a proportionate response to a slap, that the person who killed her is sitting in that courtroom hoping for leniency. They want the judge to see what they see. A girl who threatened violence in text messages, who carried a weapon, who used it in a way that was excessive and unnecessary, and who then tried to cover it up by washing away the evidence. That's not self-defense. That's a crime that deserves real consequences. Brianna's family sits on the opposite side, their faces etched with exhaustion and sorrow. They've watched their daughter go from college student to defendant, from someone with a clean record to someone facing years in prison. They believe she was scared. They believe she was defending herself. They believe the system is punishing her for surviving a situation she didn't create. They want the judge to see the video, to see the retreat, to see the fear, and to recognize that Brianna is not a danger to society. She's not a violent criminal. She's a young woman who made a terrible decision in a moment of panic and has already paid an enormous price in guilt, trauma, and public condemnation. They're hoping for probation, or at the very least, a sentence measured in months rather than years. The chapter ends with the judge listening, his face impassive, giving nothing away. He's heard both sides. He's reviewed the evidence. He's read the pre-sentence investigation report. He knows Brianna's background, her lack of criminal history, her age, her potential for rehabilitation. But he also knows that a 17-year-old girl is dead, that no amount of fear or retreat or self-defense justification can bring her back, that the law requires accountability, especially where a life has been lost. In just moments, he'll speak, and whatever numbers come out of his mouth will be final. There's no appeal from a plea agreement, no second chance to argue for a different outcome. This is it. The moment where words become years, where justice becomes concrete, where two families learn whether the legal system's answer to their pain feels anything like closure. Before sentencing, the judge invites victim impact statements. This is the moment when Halia's family can speak directly to the court, when they can put a human face on the legal abstractions of charges and sentences and plea agreements. One by one, they step forward to the microphone. Their voices shake with grief that's still raw, still fresh, still unbearable even months after the funeral. They describe sleepless nights where every time they close their eyes, they see Halia's face. They talk about holidays that will never be the same, birthdays that will be marked with cemetery visits instead of cake and candles. They speak about the empty chair at the dinner table, the silence in the house where her laughter used to echo, the phone that will never ring with her voice on the other end. Every word is a reminder that this isn't just a legal proceeding. This is about a real person who had dreams and plans and people who loved her desperately. Halia's brother speaks through tears about the night she died. He describes holding her in that parking lot, pressing his shirt against the wound, feeling her blood soak through the fabric and onto his hands. He talks about the weight of that memory, how it follows him everywhere, how he can't shake the image of her eyes or the sound of people screaming her name. He tells the court that he's watched his brothers die in his arms before, and he carries the guilt of not being able to save them. And now he carries the same guilt about Halia. He did everything he could. He applied pressure. He begged her to stay awake. But it wasn't enough, and the person responsible for putting him in that position, for forcing him to relive that trauma, is sitting just a few feet away, hoping for leniency. The injustice of it cuts him deeper than any physical wound ever could. Her grandparents, Vicky Cashdollar and Harley Langley, speak about the Halia they raised. In the girl who hugged first and asked questions later. The girl who fought so hard to stay sober, who celebrated every clean day like a victory, who believed she could rebuild her life one choice at a time. They talk about her recovery, her strength, her determination. And they talk about how all of that was stolen in a single moment of violence. They'll never see her graduate, never see her get married, never meet her children, never hear her call them on the phone just to say she loves them. All of those future moments, all of those possibilities were erased by a knife in a parking lot. And the person who erased them might be free in just a few years. The disproportion feels crushing. How can 3 years of prison time balance out an entire lifetime that will never be lived? Observers in the courtroom notice Brianna's demeanor throughout these statements. She sits at the defense table, her posture still, her face carefully composed. She doesn't cry. She doesn't react visibly. Whether that's emotional shutdown, a conscious effort to remain composed, or genuine emotional distance, no one can truly know. But her stillness stands in stark contrast to the visible anguish of Halia's family. Some people interpret her lack of visible emotion as remorse. Others see it as indifference. The truth is probably more complicated. Trauma and guilt don't always manifest in tears. Sometimes they manifest in numbness, in the inability to fully process what's happening, in a protective wall that keeps overwhelming feelings at bay. But perception matters in a courtroom, and the perception, fair or not, is that Brianna isn't feeling what Haleah's family wants her to feel. When the victim impact statements conclude, it's Brianna's turn to speak. Judge Sarrett asks if she has anything to say before he imposes sentence. She stands, her hands gripping a piece of paper with notes she's prepared. Her voice is quiet, almost hesitant as she reads. I never once thought I would be here today with these charges. Not a day goes by that this incident hasn't been on my mind. I can understand and appreciate the harm that I have caused now. I will be living with this guilt the rest of my life. The words are careful, measured, the kind of statement that's been reviewed by her attorney to avoid saying anything that could make things worse. She's acknowledging harm without admitting intent. She's expressing regret without explicitly calling it murder. It's the balancing act every defendant has to perform when speaking in court. She continues, her voice still soft. I feel for Haleah's family and my own family. I took a life. I recognize that the victim's family will suffer for the rest of their lives. It's an acknowledgement that carries weight. She's not deflecting blame. She's not making excuses in this moment. She's owning, at least verbally, that her actions caused irreversible harm. To some people in the courtroom, the statement sounds sincere. They hear a young woman grappling with guilt and trying to express remorse in a situation where no words will ever be adequate. To others, particularly Haleah's family, the statement feels hollow. Too little, too late, too carefully crafted by lawyers to sound apologetic without admitting the full scope of what she did. The words might be sincere, but they're also strategic. And in the shadow of a dead 17-year-old, strategy feels like an insult. For Haleah's grandparents and siblings, no apology is enough. They listen to Brianna's words, but they don't soften. They don't nod in acceptance. They don't feel the closure that victim impact statements and defendant allocutions are supposed to provide. Because there is no closure. There's only the permanent absence of someone they love and the inadequate presence of words trying to fill that void. The gap between 3 years in prison and forever in a grave feels unbridgeable. No statement, no matter how heartfelt, can cross that distance. Brianna can say she'll live with guilt for the rest of her life, but Haleah's family will live with loss for the rest of theirs. And loss is heavier than guilt. The narrator points out a truth that runs through so many true crime cases. Remorse and justice rarely line up cleanly. The legal system wants defendants to express regret because it signals rehabilitation, because it suggests they understand the harm they caused and won't repeat it. But for victims' families, remorse often feels performative. It feels like something defendants say because their lawyers told them to, because it might reduce their sentence, because it's expected. And even when remorse is genuine, even when a defendant truly feels the weight of what they've done, it doesn't change the outcome. It doesn't bring anyone back. It doesn't heal the wound. It's just words in a room full of people who are all trying to find meaning in something that feels fundamentally meaningless. A young life ended, another young life derailed, and everyone left behind struggling to call that justice. The chapter closes as all eyes turn back to Judge Sarrett. The victim impact statements are complete. Brianna's allocution is finished. The prosecutor and defense attorney have said everything they came to say. The room falls into a heavy, expectant silence. The air feels thick, almost hard to breathe. Everyone knows what's coming next. The judge will speak. He'll announce the sentence. And whatever number he says will become the official answer to the question that's haunted this case from the beginning. How much is a life worth? How many years in prison equal the death of a 17-year-old girl? There's no right answer, but there's no number that will satisfy everyone. But in seconds, there will be a number, and it will be final. Judge Mark Serrett begins by acknowledging the complexity of the case, his voice calm and measured, carrying the weight of someone who understands that whatever he says next will be scrutinized, criticized, and remembered. He notes that this is not a simple matter. It's not a case where one side is clearly right and the other clearly wrong. There's a young defendant with no previous criminal record, someone who by all accounts lived a law-abiding life up until that night. There's clear evidence of fear and retreat, video footage showing her backing away repeatedly, trying to avoid confrontation. But there's also a dead teenager, a girl who will never graduate, never fall in love, never have children, never grow old. A girl whose family sits in this courtroom with a permanent hole in their lives. And there's a weapon used in a way that escalated a fistfight into a fatal stabbing. The judge has to weigh all of it, and the balance is impossibly delicate. He continues, explaining that under Ohio law, Brianna is technically eligible for probation. The statute allows for community control sanctions, meaning she could serve her sentence under supervision without spending any time in prison. For a brief moment, the defense side of the courtroom feels a flicker of hope. Eligible for probation. Those words suggest possibility, a chance that Brianna might avoid prison altogether. Her family leans forward slightly, holding their breath, waiting to hear if the judge will exercise that option. If he grants probation, she could go home today. She could rebuild her life, attend counseling, complete community service, and eventually move past this nightmare. It's a slim hope, but in this moment, it's the only hope they have left. But then Judge Serrett makes his position clear. Despite eligibility, I will not be granting probation. The words land like a hammer. The flicker of hope extinguishes instantly. Brianna's shoulders sag slightly. Her mother's face crumples. The judge explains his reasoning with the careful precision of someone who knows this decision will be dissected by media, by advocates, by everyone who follows this case. He says that the seriousness of the crime and the irreversible harm demand more than community supervision. A life was taken. A family was shattered, and while probation might be legally available, it would not be appropriate. It would not reflect the gravity of what happened. It would not serve justice. The community needs to know that taking a life, even in a moment of fear or panic, carries real consequences. And those consequences must include incarceration. He then methodically weighs the mitigating and aggravating factors, laying out his thought process for the record. On the mitigating side, he acknowledges Brianna's youth. She was 19 at the time of the offense, barely out of her teenage years, still developing emotionally and neurologically. He acknowledges her clean record. She had no prior arrests, no history of violence, no pattern of criminal behavior. This was an isolated incident, not part of a criminal lifestyle. He acknowledges the fear she experienced during the encounter, the fact that she did attempt to retreat, that she was struck first, and that there's video evidence supporting some elements of her self-defense claim. These are real factors that weigh in her favor, and the judge doesn't minimize them. But then he turns to the aggravating factors, and the list is longer and heavier. First and foremost, the death of a 17-year-old girl. Halia Culbertson had her entire life ahead of her. She was working on her recovery, rebuilding relationships, moving forward. And all of that ended in a parking lot because of a knife wound to the neck. Second, the use of a deadly weapon. Brianna didn't punch or shove. She used a knife, a tool specifically designed to cut and pierce, and she used it in one of the most vulnerable areas of the human body. Third, her behavior after the incident. She didn't call for help. She didn't wait for police. She went home, showered, and washed her clothes. That behavior suggests an awareness that what she did was wrong, an attempt to distance herself from the consequences. And fourth, perhaps most damning, the prior threatening text messages. The judge references them explicitly. Messages where Brianna wrote about slicing Halia if she came near. Messages that show she had thought about violence before it happened. that she had verbalized it, that when she put that knife in her pocket, it wasn't purely coincidental. The judge emphasizes that these texts are not just angry words. They're evidence of a mindset, a willingness to respond to confrontation with deadly force. And that mindset is what makes this case more than just a tragic accident. It's what transforms it into a crime that requires serious punishment. The aggravating factors, he concludes, outweigh the mitigating ones, not by a small margin, but significantly. Judge Sarett recognizes that Brianna has expressed remorse in her statement to the court. He acknowledges that she seems to understand the harm she caused and that she will carry guilt for the rest of her life. But he also emphasizes that accountability requires more than words. Remorse is important for rehabilitation, but it doesn't erase the harm. It doesn't bring Halia back, and it doesn't absolve Brianna of the need to face consequences. The court, he says, has a responsibility to the victim's family, and to the community. That responsibility is to ensure that the sentence reflects the seriousness of the offense, that it acknowledges the value of the life that was lost, and that it sends a message that violence has real, tangible costs. He underscores a point that the prosecutor made earlier. Many people are slapped, many people are provoked, many people are insulted and threatened and confronted, and the overwhelming majority of them do not respond by stabbing someone. That restraint, that ability to control one's response even in the face of anger or fear, is what separates a difficult situation from a tragedy. Brianna did not exercise that restraint. She escalated, and that escalation resulted in a death. The court cannot treat that as an acceptable response to teenage conflict. It cannot send a message that carrying a weapon and using it in a parking lot fight is something that can be overlooked or minimized. There have to be consequences. Real, significant consequences. If the tension in the courtroom peaks as the judge prepares to announce the actual sentence, Halia's family braces themselves, unsure whether they're about to hear days, months, or years. Brianna stands still, her hands clasped in front of her, her face pale. Her family sits frozen, barely breathing. The entire room is suspended in that moment before the gavel falls, before the number is spoken, before the abstract concept of justice becomes a concrete reality measured in time. The judge looks directly at Brianna, and the chapter ends right there, holding that moment of suspended breath, that instant before everything changes, that final heartbeat before the sentence is pronounced and the courtroom exhales and two families learn what justice looks like in numbers. Judge Sarett's voice cuts through the silence with finality. I'm going to give you a 3-year prison sentence, 3 days jail credit. You are going to have the ability for early release, and I will consider that at the appropriate time. The words settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. 3 years. The maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement. Prosecutors have secured the longest punishment available for involuntary manslaughter. But to Halia's family, even the maximum feels impossibly light. 3 years is 1,095 days. Halia has been gone for over a year already, and the person who killed her will serve less time than it takes to earn a bachelor's degree. The math feels obscene. The exchange feels unequal. A lifetime for 3 years. An entire future for a sentence that could end with early release in even less time. The courtroom exhales in a mix of relief and sorrow that differs depending on which side of the aisle you're sitting on. For the prosecution, this is a win. They secured the maximum. They held Brianna accountable. They ensured that Halia's death was recognized as a crime with real consequences. For Brianna's family, there's a complicated mixture of grief and gratitude. Their daughter is going to prison, but not for 15 years. Not for life. She'll serve her time, and if she behaves well, she'll have a chance at early release. She'll still be in her 20s when she gets out. She'll still have the opportunity to rebuild, to go back to school, to have a career, to have a life. It's not the outcome they hoped for when this all started, but compared to what could have happened if the case went to trial and resulted in a murder conviction, it feels like a version of mercy. But for Halea's family, there is no version of this that feels like justice. Her grandmother sits with tears streaming down her face, shaking her head. Her grandfather stares straight ahead, jaw clenched, fists tight. 3 years. The judge can call it the maximum, but it doesn't change the fundamental imbalance. Halea will be in the ground forever. Brianna will be out of prison before she turns 25. How is that fair? How is that proportional? How does that acknowledge the value of the life that was taken? They know the legal system has limits. They know the plea agreement capped the sentence. They know that without the plea, there was a risk Brianna could have been acquitted entirely. But knowing all of that doesn't make the outcome any easier to accept. It just makes the whole system feel broken. Judge Sarrett adds a stern warning before concluding the sentencing. He tells Brianna directly that her behavior in prison will matter, that she needs to take responsibility for her rehabilitation, participate in programs, follow the rules, and genuinely work on understanding what she did and why she can never do it again. He emphasizes that early release is not automatic. It's a privilege that must be earned through demonstrated change and accountability. If she treats prison as something to endure rather than an opportunity to transform, she'll serve every single day of that 3-year sentence. But if she takes it seriously, if she shows real growth, he'll consider granting her early release when the time comes. It's both a carrot and a stick, an incentive to cooperate and a warning not to waste the chance she's been given. And the narrator contrasts the timelines that will now define both families' futures. 3 years in a concrete cell with barbed wire and guard towers versus eternity in a cemetery plot with flowers and a headstone. One girl will eventually walk out of a gate into daylight, breathe free air, hug her family, and start rebuilding the pieces of her life. The other will never leave the 6 feet of earth where her casket rests. She'll never feel sunshine again, never laugh with friends, never fall in love, never achieve any of the dreams she was working toward. The asymmetry is the cruelest part of the entire case. Both girls' lives were changed forever that night, but only one of them still has a life to change. Outside the courtroom, after the gavel falls and the proceedings conclude, opinions split sharply along lines that reflect broader debates about justice, self-defense, and accountability. Some people in the community argue that the sentence is fair given the self-defense elements. They point to the video showing Brianna retreating, to the evidence that Halea initiated the physical confrontation, to the threatening behavior that preceded the stabbing. They see a scared young woman who made a tragic mistake in a moment of panic and terror. They believe 3 years is appropriate for someone who didn't plan to kill, who tried to avoid the fight, and who will carry the psychological burden of what happened for the rest of her life. To them, Brianna is both a defendant and a victim of circumstances that spiraled beyond her control. Others argue vehemently that no sentence under a decade can honor a 17-year-old's stolen future. They point to the text messages showing premeditation, to the choice to carry a knife, to the excessive force used against an unarmed person, to the behavior after the stabbing that suggests consciousness of guilt. They see a young woman who threatened violence, prepared for violence, and then executed that violence when given the opportunity. They believe the plea deal was too generous, that the manslaughter charge was a gift Brianna didn't deserve, and that 3 years is an insult to Halea's memory. To them, this case represents everything wrong with a justice system that prioritizes defendants' rights over victims' lives. Social media explodes with debates that mirror the courtroom arguments. People who have never met either girl, who weren't there that night, who didn't sit through the hearings, still have strong opinions about who was right and who was wrong. Some comments defend Brianna, arguing that women have the right to defend themselves and that Halea's aggression justified the response. Others condemn her, arguing that carrying a knife and using it on an unarmed person is never justified. The case becomes a flashpoint for larger conversations about self-defense laws, about teen violence, about how the justice system values young lives, especially young lives marked by recovery and struggle. And through it all, two families grieve in very different but equally profound ways. Final visual echoes intercut to close the story. Brianna is led away from the courtroom in handcuffs, her head down. Hear her family watching from the gallery as she's taken through a side door toward the transport vehicle that will carry her to prison. She's dressed in the same outfit she wore to the sentencing, but now she's leaving as an inmate, a convicted felon, someone whose name will forever be attached to the words involuntary manslaughter. Her life as she knew it is over. The college plans, the career dreams, the normal trajectory of a suburban young woman, all of it has been derailed by one night. One confrontation, one decision to use a knife instead of running away. Halia's grandparents clutch a framed photo of her smiling. It's the same photo that's been on the prosecutor's table throughout the proceedings, the one that shows her laughing and vibrant and alive. They hold it close as they leave the courthouse, surrounded by family and friends who have supported them through every unbearable step of this process. The photo is all they have left now, memories frozen in pixels and glass. On a reminder of who she was before a parking lot and a knife and 3 minutes of violence erased everything she was supposed to become. They'll go home to that empty chair, to that silent bedroom, to a future marked by anniversaries of loss rather than celebrations of achievement. The parking lot of 161. Carry Out at Night is shown in a quiet, empty shot. The neon smoke shop sign still glows. The glass doors still reflect the asphalt, where insults once turned to blood. But there's no crime scene tape now, no crowd of onlookers, no phones filming, just an ordinary convenience store where ordinary people stop for ordinary reasons, most of them never knowing that this exact spot was where a teenage girl bled out while her brother held her and begged her to stay alive. The ordinariness is haunting. The world moved on. The store stayed open. Life continued. But for two families, time stopped that night and has never really started again. The narrator returns to the core questions that have threaded through the entire story. How thin is the line between self-defense and murder? How many teenagers carry knives, tempers, and grudges, convinced they're not the type to kill until the wrong shove, the wrong word, the wrong night proves them catastrophically wrong? How many confrontations that start with insults and escalate to violence could be stopped if just one person chose to walk away, to swallow their pride, to value life more than reputation? These aren't questions with easy answers. They're the uncomfortable truths that sit at the heart of cases like this, where both sides have legitimate grievances and both sides have made choices that can't be undone. The story closes on a moral echo that brings everything full circle. One word, one insult, one swing of a knife. She thought her clean record and her fear would protect her. Instead, it was her own messages, her own choices. That wrote her sentence. Brianna believed she was defending herself. She believed the law would see her as a victim. She believed her story would be enough. But the evidence told a different story. A story of threats made in advance, of a weapon carried with purpose, of force used beyond what was necessary. And in the end, the evidence spoke louder than any defense attorney ever could. The text messages became her undoing. The words she typed in anger became the proof of intent. And the knife she carried became the instrument of both Halia's death and her own conviction. Optional final call to action. If you think justice was or wasn't served in this case, make sure others see this story too. Share it, discuss it, and ask yourself, at what point should someone have stepped in, long before a judge ever had to speak? When do we stop being bystanders filming confrontations and start being the people who prevent them? because somewhere tonight, in another parking lot, two former friends are squaring off over an insult. And the only difference between that confrontation and this one might be whether someone chooses to intervene before it's too late. The transport van pulls up to the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, about 30 miles northwest of Columbus. Brianna sits in the back, hands cuffed, staring out the small window at the razor wire coiled along the top of the chain-link fences. This is her new reality. No more suburban bedroom. No more college campus. No more quiet dinners with her family. Just concrete walls, metal doors, and the constant hum of institutional life that never truly sleeps. The van doors open, and correctional officers guide her through intake processing. She's photographed, fingerprinted again, given a medical evaluation, and issued standard prison clothing. The person who walked into court wearing her own clothes is now inmate number whatever the system assigns her. Identity reduced to a number and a charge. Intake is a dehumanizing process designed to strip away the outside world and prepare inmates for the rigid structure of prison life. Brianna is asked about gang affiliations, mental health history, substance abuse, disciplinary concerns. She answers quietly, still processing the fact that this is real. This isn't a holding cell she'll leave in a few hours. This is where she'll live for the next 3 years, possibly less if she earns early release, but definitely not home. She's assigned to a cell in general population, a small space she'll share with another inmate. The cell contains 2 narrow beds bolted to the wall, a shared toilet with no privacy screen, a small metal desk, and a tiny window that offers a sliver of sky. It's nothing like the bedroom she left behind. It's nothing like anything she's ever experienced. Her cellmate is a woman in her mid-30s, serving time for drug-related offenses. She's been in the system before, knows how things work, and quickly sizes up Brianna as a first-timer. The unwritten rules of prison are explained in blunt terms. Keep your head down. Don't ask too many questions. Don't trust everyone who acts friendly. Mind your own business. Stay out of other people's drama. The hierarchy inside is different from the outside. Clean records and college degrees don't matter here. What matters is how you carry yourself, whether you can handle conflict without escalating it, and whether you're willing to adapt to a world where control is an illusion and survival is a daily negotiation. The first few nights are the hardest. Brianna lies awake listening to sounds she's never heard before. Doors slamming, women shouting across cells, guards making their rounds. The fluorescent lights in the hallway never fully turn off, casting a perpetual gray glow into her cell. She thinks about her family, about the courtroom, about Halia, and the guilt that she acknowledged in her statement to the judge now has nowhere to hide. In the outside world, there were distractions, routines, ways to avoid thinking too deeply. In prison, there's nothing but time. Time to think. Time to remember. Time to replay that night in the parking lot over and over until every detail is burned into her memory, like a scar that will never fade. Prison routines are rigid and unforgiving. Wake up is early, usually around 5:30 in the morning. Our breakfast is served in a crowded cafeteria where inmates line up with trays and eat quickly under the watchful eyes of correctional officers. The food is bland, institutional, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. After breakfast, inmates are assigned to work details or programs. Brianna is initially assigned to kitchen duty, a common placement for new inmates. She spends hours washing dishes, cleaning floors, preparing food trays for hundreds of women. The work is monotonous and exhausting, but it keeps her occupied. And in prison, occupation is a form of mercy. Idle time is when the mind wanders to dark places. She also begins attending mandatory programs designed for rehabilitation, anger management classes, conflict resolution workshops, victim impact panels where inmates hear from people whose lives have been affected by crime. These sessions are uncomfortable, and they force Brianna to confront the harm she caused in ways the courtroom never did. In court, everything was abstract, filtered through legal language and procedural formality. In these programs, the harm is personal. She hears stories from mothers who lost children to violence. She hears from siblings who can't sleep because they watched their brother or sister die. And every story echoes with the reality of what Halia's family is experiencing, of the reality that her actions created a wound that will never fully heal. Brianna writes letters home. Her family visits when they can, though the visiting room is a stark, uncomfortable place with plastic chairs and vending machines and correctional officers monitoring every conversation. Her mother cries during the first visit, struggling to reconcile the image of her daughter in a prison uniform with the girl she raised. Brianna tries to stay strong, tries to reassure her family that she's okay, but the truth is more complicated. She's not okay. She's surviving. She's adapting. But she's also carrying a weight that grows heavier every day. The weight of knowing that while she's counting down days toward release, Halia's family is counting the rest of their lives without their daughter. The chapter ends with Brianna sitting alone in her cell late at night, staring at the small window where a sliver of moonlight filters through. And outside those walls, life is continuing. Friends are graduating, people are falling in love, families are celebrating holidays. But inside, time moves differently. It stretches and compresses in strange ways. 3 years sounds manageable when a judge says it in a courtroom. But when you're living it, day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, it feels endless. And for Brianna, every single one of those days will be marked by the knowledge that she took a life, and that no amount of time served will ever bring Halia back. That justice, whatever that word means, came with a price she's only beginning to understand. While Brianna adjusts to life behind bars, Halia's family faces a different kind of prison, one without walls or guards, but just as confining. The prison of grief, the prison of a future that will never arrive. Halia's bedroom sits untouched, exactly as she left it. Her clothes still hang in the closet. Her makeup is still scattered across the dresser. Her phone charger is still plugged into the wall, waiting for a device that will never need charging again. Her grandparents, Vicky and Harley, can't bring themselves to pack it up yet. It feels too final. Too much like admitting she's really gone. So the room stays frozen in time, a museum of a life that ended too soon. Holidays are the worst. The first Thanksgiving without Halia is unbearable. The family gathers as they always have. But the empty chair at the table is a presence louder than any conversation. They set a place for her anyway, a symbolic gesture that feels both comforting and cruel. Her favorite foods are prepared out of habit, even though no one will eat them. Her grandmother breaks down halfway through the meal, excusing herself to the bathroom, where she sobs into a towel so the rest of the family won't hear. But they do hear, and they understand, because they're all carrying the same weight. On the weight of trying to celebrate life when the person they're celebrating for is no longer alive. Christmas is even harder. Halia loved Christmas. She loved decorating the tree, wrapping presents, singing carols off-key while baking cookies with her grandmother. This year the tree goes up, but it feels like a hollow ritual. Presents are exchanged, but no one has the heart to enjoy them. The joy has been drained from every tradition, are replaced by a heavy sadness that settles over the house like fog. Her brother spends most of Christmas Day at the cemetery, sitting beside her grave, talking to her as if she can hear. He tells her about the sentencing, about Brianna going to prison, about how 3 years doesn't feel like enough. He tells her he's sorry he couldn't save her, that he tried, that he'll carry that guilt forever. Her grandparents throw themselves into advocacy work, channeling their grief into action. They speak at community events about teen violence, about the dangers of carrying weapons, about the importance of conflict resolution. They share Halia's story, not to seek pity, but to prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. Vicky becomes particularly vocal, giving interviews to local news stations, writing op-eds for newspapers, attending town hall meetings. She talks about the gaps in the justice system, about how a 3-year sentence for taking a life feels inadequate, and about how plea deals prioritize efficiency over accountability. Her voice shakes with emotion, but she never stops speaking, because speaking is the only way she knows how to keep Halia's memory alive. The financial burden of loss is something people rarely talk about, but it's real and it's crushing. Halia's family faces funeral costs, cemetery expenses, legal fees from participating in the court proceedings. They take time off work to attend hearings, to meet with prosecutors, to sit through the emotional ordeal of victim impact statements. The loss isn't just emotional, it's financial, it's logistical. It's the practical reality of navigating a system that wasn't designed with grieving families in mind. And while Brianna's family is dealing with legal bills and bond payments, Halia's family is dealing with the permanent absence of a daughter, granddaughter, sister, and friend who will never contribute to the household again, never help with bills, never share expenses, never be there in the ways families rely on each other. Halia's friends struggle in their own ways. Some drop out of school, some turn to substances to numb the pain. Some throw themselves into activism, organizing vigils and awareness campaigns. Others pull away, unable to process the trauma of watching their friend die. The ripple effects of that night in the parking lot extend far beyond the two families directly involved. Teachers notice students struggling. Counselors see an increase in therapy requests. The community feels the weight of a tragedy that could have been prevented if just one person had made a different choice. If the store employee had called the police earlier, if someone in the crowd had physically intervened instead of filming, if Brianna had stayed inside until help arrived, if Halia had walked away instead of waiting outside. The what-ifs are endless and agonizing. Halia's grandmother starts a scholarship fund in her name, aimed at helping young people in recovery pursue education. It's a way to honor the progress Halia made in her sobriety, to recognize that her life was about more than how it ended. The scholarship is small, but it's meaningful. Each year, one student receives financial support to attend college or vocational training with the understanding that they're carrying Halia's legacy forward. The first recipient is a young woman who knew Halia, who attended the same recovery meetings, who cried at her funeral. When she accepts the scholarship, she gives a speech about how Halia inspired her to keep fighting, to keep believing that recovery is possible. It's a bittersweet moment, a reminder that Halia's impact didn't end with her death. The chapter ends with Halia's grandfather visiting her grave on what would have been her 18th birthday. He brings flowers and a cupcake with a single candle. He lights the candle and sings "Happy Birthday" in a voice that breaks halfway through. He talks to her about all the things she's missing, the milestones she'll never reach, the memories they'll never make. He tells her about the scholarship, about the advocacy work, about how hard everyone is fighting to make sure her death meant something. But even as he says the words, he knows the truth. No amount of advocacy or scholarships or awareness campaigns will bring her back. Justice was served. Yes, at least in the legal sense, Brianna is in prison. But for Halia's family, there is no such thing as closure. There's only the long, slow process of learning to live with a wound that will never fully heal. The case of Brianna Berezini and Halia Culbertson doesn't end when the courtroom doors close. It spills out into the community, into social media, into living rooms and coffee shops where strangers debate guilt and innocence, justice and mercy, without knowing either girl personally. On local news stations cover the sentencing extensively. The footage of Brianna being led away in handcuffs is replayed on evening broadcasts. Headlines read, "College student sentenced to 3 years for fatal stabbing," and "Teen dies in parking lot, fight gone wrong." The framing varies depending on the outlet. Some emphasize the self-defense elements. Others focus on the text messages that suggested premeditation. And each framing shapes public perception in profound ways. Social media becomes a battleground. On Facebook, community groups dedicated to crime and justice are flooded with posts about the case. People who have never met Brianna or Halia weigh in with strong opinions. Some argue that Brianna was a victim of circumstances, forced to defend herself against an aggressive attacker. They point to the video evidence, to the retreating steps, to the slaps and shoves that preceded the stabbing. They argue that women have the right to protect themselves, that Halia's behavior was threatening, and that Brianna should have been acquitted entirely. These commenters see the 3-year sentence as excessive, a punishment for surviving an encounter she didn't initiate. Others see the case very differently. They focus on the text messages, on the fact that Brianna threatened violence days before the encounter. They argue that carrying a knife to a convenience store, especially when you know there might be conflict, shows intent. They believe the manslaughter plea was too lenient, that Brianna should have been convicted of murder and sentenced to decades in prison. They see Halia as the real victim, a recovering addict trying to rebuild her life who was killed by someone who came prepared to use deadly force. These commenters view the 3-year sentence as an insult, a failure of the justice system to adequately value Halia's life. The debate becomes particularly heated around issues of race, class, and privilege. Some community members point out that Brianna is a white suburban college student with no prior record, and they question whether the outcome would have been the same if she were black or Latina, or from a low-income neighborhood. They cite statistics showing disparities in sentencing, in plea deal offers, in media coverage that frames white defendants more sympathetically than defendants of color. Others push back, arguing that the case should be judged on its facts, not on broader systemic issues. But the conversation about privilege is unavoidable, because the reality is that defendants with resources, with educated families, with access to experienced attorneys, often fare better in the justice system than those without. Media coverage amplifies these divisions. One local news station runs a segment titled "Self-Defense or Murder: The Fine Line in Ohio Law," featuring interviews with legal experts who explain the complexities of stand-your-ground statutes. Another station focuses on Halia's recovery journey, interviewing her family and friends about the progress she made before her life was cut short. A third station examines the broader issue of teen violence, using the case as a springboard to discuss conflict resolution programs in schools. And each angle is valid, but each also shapes how viewers understand the case. And in the age of algorithm-driven media, people tend to see coverage that reinforces their existing beliefs rather than challenges them. Online forums dedicated to true crime pick up the story. Reddit threads dissect every detail of the case, with armchair detectives analyzing the surveillance video frame by frame, debating whether Brianna had sufficient room to escape, questioning why no one in the crowd intervened. Some users express sympathy for both girls, recognizing that this was a tragedy with no clear villains, just two young women whose lives intersected at the worst possible moment. Others are less nuanced, declaring Brianna a cold-blooded killer, or Halia a violent aggressor, depending on their interpretation of the evidence. The anonymity of online spaces allows people to express opinions they might not voice in public, and the result is a toxic mix of genuine insight and baseless speculation. The case also becomes a talking point in debates about self-defense laws. Gun rights advocates use it as an example of why people need to be able to protect themselves, arguing that if more women carried weapons, they'd be less vulnerable to assault. Gun control advocates use it as an example of why weapons escalate conflicts, arguing that if Brianna hadn't had a knife, the altercation would have ended with bruises instead of a death. Both sides claim the case supports their position, and both sides ignore the complexities that don't fit neatly into their narratives. The truth is that this case doesn't prove anything about gun laws or self-defense statutes in general. It's one specific situation with unique circumstances. But nuance doesn't drive clicks or donations or political momentum. Local community leaders attempt to channel the public discourse into something productive. Churches hold forums on forgiveness and reconciliation. So schools bring in speakers to talk about conflict resolution and the dangers of carrying weapons. Youth organizations create programs aimed at teaching teenagers how to de-escalate confrontations before they turn violent. These efforts are well-intentioned and important, but they also face an uphill battle. Because changing culture requires more than a few programs or speeches. It requires a fundamental shift in how young people think about conflict, about pride, and about what it means to win a confrontation. And that kind of change happens slowly, if it happens at all. The chapter ends with a split screen of sorts. On one side, Brianna in prison, reading letters from strangers who either support her or condemn her, trying to make sense of how her case became a symbol for debates she never intended to be part of. On the other side, Halia's family watching the news coverage, and feeling frustrated that their daughter's life has been reduced to a talking point, a hashtag, a case number. Both sides are struggling with the weight of public attention, with the way their private tragedy has become public property. And in the middle are two communities, one that knew Halia, one that knew Brianna, trying to heal while the rest of the world debates who deserved what. Justice may have been served in the legal sense, but in the court of public opinion, the verdict is still out, and it probably always will be. 6 months into her sentence, Brianna has settled into the rhythm of prison life, though settled is perhaps too gentle a word for the reality of incarceration. She wakes at the same time every morning, eats the same bland meals, works the same kitchen shifts, attends the same programs. The monotony is both numbing and suffocating. Time moves in strange ways behind bars. Days blur together, but individual moments, a letter from home, a tense interaction with another inmate, a particularly difficult therapy session, stand out with painful clarity. She's no longer the college student with a clean record and a promising future. She's an inmate, and that identity reshapes everything. Therapy becomes a lifeline. The prison offers individual counseling sessions for inmates willing to participate, and Brianna signs up. Her therapist is a woman in her 50s who has worked in correctional facilities for decades. She's seen every kind of inmate, heard every kind of story, and she doesn't approach Brianna with judgment. Instead, she asks questions. What were you feeling in the moments before the stabbing? What do you think you could have done differently? How do you reconcile the person you believed yourself to be with the person who took a life? These questions are uncomfortable. They force Brianna to sit with her actions in ways she never did before. In the months leading up to the plea, survival mode kicked in. Her focus was on avoiding a murder conviction, on minimizing the sentence, on protecting herself. Now, with that behind her, there's nowhere to hide from the truth. One of the hardest parts of therapy is examining the text messages she sent. Her therapist prints them out and asks Brianna to read them aloud in session. I'd sooner slice Culbertson's blank if she comes near me again. Hearing her own words spoken back to her is devastating. She tries to explain that she was angry, that she didn't really mean it, that people say things they don't mean all the time. But her therapist pushes back gently. If you didn't mean it, why did you carry a knife that night? If you didn't mean it, why did you use it when confronted? The questions aren't designed to shame her. They're designed to help her see the gap between the narrative she constructed for herself and the reality of her actions. And closing that gap is essential for any kind of genuine rehabilitation. Brianna also participates in a victim impact program unlike any she's attended before. This one involves restorative justice circles where inmates sit with community members affected by crime. They don't meet the victims of their specific crimes. Halia's family has no interest in sitting across from Brianna, but they meet other families who have lost loved ones to violence. Brianna listens as a mother describes finding her son's body after a stabbing. She listens as a sister talks about the nightmares that won't stop, the flashbacks, the therapy bills that pile up. She listens as a father explains how his family disintegrated after his daughter was killed, how grief tore them apart in ways they're still trying to repair. These stories are brutal. They're mirrors held up to the harm she caused. And they make it impossible to cling to the comforting lie that she's just a victim of circumstance. During one particularly difficult session, Brianna breaks down. She sobs in a way she hasn't since the night of the stabbing, the weight of everything finally crashing down on her. She talks about the guilt that follows her everywhere, about the nightmares where she's back in that parking lot but can't stop herself from swinging the knife, about the letters she's tried to write to Halia's family but can never bring herself to finish because no words feel adequate. The other inmates in the circle listen. Some offer comfort, others challenge her. One woman, serving time for a drunk driving accident that killed 2 people, looks Brianna in the eye and says, "Guilt isn't enough. You have to do something with it. You have to become someone different than the person who made that choice. Otherwise, you're just serving time. I'm not actually changing." That becomes Brianna's focus, becoming someone different. She starts reading books on conflict resolution, on the psychology of violence, on the ways trauma and fear can distort decision-making. She enrolls in educational programs offered by the prison, working toward completing her associate's degree. She volunteers for peer mentoring, helping newer inmates navigate the system. She writes letters to schools, sharing her story as a cautionary tale, hoping that if teenagers hear from someone who actually lived the consequences, they might make different choices. Not all the letters get responses. Some schools don't want a convicted killer addressing their students. But a few do. And knowing that her story might prevent even one other person from making the same mistake gives her a sense of purpose she desperately needs. Her relationship with her family evolves during this time. Her mother visits regularly, but the visits are hard. There's love, but there's also tension. Her mother oscillates between defending Brianna to outsiders and feeling angry at her in private. Angry that she carried a knife. Angry that she didn't call the police. Angry that their lives have been upended by choices Brianna made in a matter of seconds. They don't always talk about these feelings directly, but they're present in every conversation, every silence, every goodbye at the end of visiting hours. Brianna's stepfather visits less frequently. He struggles with how to support his stepdaughter while also acknowledging that someone died. That moral complexity is hard to navigate, and sometimes it's easier to just stay away. Brianna also faces hostility from some of the other inmates. Not everyone is sympathetic to her story. Some see her as privileged, a suburban white girl who got a light sentence because of who she is. Others see her crime as cowardly, using a weapon against an unarmed person. There are occasional confrontations, verbal mostly, though once it escalates to shoving before guards intervene. Brianna learns quickly that in prison, your story precedes you. Everyone knows everyone's charges, and how you're perceived depends not just on what you did, but on how you carry yourself afterward. Humility helps, arrogance is punished, and Brianna, to her credit, leans toward the former. She doesn't make excuses. She doesn't pretend to be a victim. And she acknowledges what she did and tries to do better. Slowly, over months, that earns her a measure of respect. The chapter ends with Brianna sitting in the prison library late at night, writing in a journal her therapist encouraged her to keep. She writes about the person she was before that night, the person who thought she was nonviolent, who believed she would never hurt anyone, who carried a knife just in case without really thinking about what that meant. She writes about the moment the knife went in, about the split second where everything changed and couldn't be undone. And she writes about the person she's trying to become, someone who understands the weight of her choices, someone who has to live with the fact that her fear, her anger, her decision to carry and use a weapon resulted in a 17-year-old girl dying in a parking lot. She writes, "I can't bring Halia back. I can't undo what I did. But I can make sure that the rest of my life is different, that I never let fear turn into violence again, that I become someone her family wouldn't have to hate quite so much." It's a small, fragile hope, but in prison, hope is all you have. 18 months into her sentence, Brianna becomes eligible for early release. Under Ohio law, inmates convicted of nonviolent felonies can petition for early release after serving a certain percentage of their sentence, particularly if they've demonstrated good behavior and participated in rehabilitation programs. Brianna has done both. Her record inside is clean. She's completed her associate's degree. She's participated in every program offered. Her therapist writes a letter supporting her release, noting significant progress in her emotional regulation and accountability. On paper, she's exactly the kind of inmate the system is designed to rehabilitate. But the question isn't whether she's eligible for early release. It's whether granting it would be just. The petition for early release requires a hearing before Judge Serrett, the same judge who sentenced her. Halia's family is notified and given the opportunity to submit statements opposing the release. They don't hesitate. Vicky writes a letter that is both heartbroken and furious. She acknowledges that Brianna has followed the rules, has participated in programs, has said and done the things the system asks of her, but she also points out that 18 months is barely a fraction of the time Halia has been gone, that Brianna will still be young when she gets out, with decades of life ahead of her, that Halia will never have that opportunity. The letter ends with a plea. 18 months is not justice. 3 years was already too little. Please don't make it even less. Harley writes his own letter, less polished but no less powerful. He describes the milestones Halia has already missed, the 18th birthday she never celebrated, the high school graduation that should have happened, the college classes she'll never attend. He writes about the empty seat at Thanksgiving and Christmas, about the grave they visit every week, about the way grief has aged him in ways no calendar can measure. He acknowledges that Brianna is young, that she made a mistake, that she deserves a chance to rebuild her life. But he also asks the court to remember that Halia deserved those same chances and never got them. "If you let her out early," he writes, "you're saying that 18 months is enough, and I'm telling you from the bottom of my heart, it's not." Brianna's attorney argues the opposite. He presents evidence of her transformation, letters from her therapist, her teachers, her mentors, certificates of completion from programs, a detailed plan for her reintegration into society, including housing with her family, enrollment in a 4-year university, and ongoing therapy. He emphasizes that the purpose of incarceration is rehabilitation, not vengeance. That Brianna has used her time in prison productively. That keeping her locked up for another 18 months serves no purpose beyond punishment for punishment's sake. He reminds the judge that early release is not a pardon. It's a recognition that an inmate has met the goals the system set for them, and Brianna has met those goals. The prosecutor opposes early release, but not as vehemently as Halia's family might hope. From the state's perspective, the case is closed. Brianna was convicted. She's serving her sentence. If she's met the requirements for early release, the law allows it. The prosecutor acknowledges Halia's family's pain and validates their feelings, but also notes that the justice system can't function on emotion alone. There are standards, procedures, criteria. And if Brianna has satisfied those criteria, the court should honor that. It's a measured, procedural argument that frustrates Halia's family. Because to them, this isn't about procedure. It's about right and wrong, about fairness, about the value of a life that was taken. Judge Serrett schedules a hearing. It's not as formal as the sentencing, but it carries the same weight. Brianna appears via video link from the prison, wearing her uniform, her face thinner than it was 18 months ago. Halia's family sits in the courtroom, their presence a silent but powerful reminder of what's at stake. The judge listens to both sides, reads the letters, reviews the evidence. He acknowledges the progress Brianna has made. He acknowledges the pain of Halia's family. And then he makes a decision that satisfies no one completely, but attempts to balance competing values. He denies the early release petition. Not because Brianna hasn't met the criteria, but because the seriousness of the offense and the impact on the victim's family warrant serving the full sentence. "You have made progress," he tells Brianna, "but 3 years was the maximum for a reason, and I believe serving that full term is appropriate." The decision is both a relief and a disappointment. For Halia's family, it's a small victory. Not the justice they wanted, but at least a recognition that 18 months isn't enough. For Brianna, it's devastating. She's done everything the system asked of her, and it still wasn't enough. She has to serve another 18 months, knowing that the progress she made didn't change the outcome. Her attorney considers appealing, but ultimately decides against it. The judge's reasoning is sound. An appeal is unlikely to succeed, and dragging the case back into the public eye might do more harm than good. So Brianna returns to her cell, and the calendar continues its slow march toward her release date. During those remaining months, Brianna struggles. The denial of early release hits her harder than she expected. She thought that if she just did everything right, if she participated and learned and grew, the system would acknowledge that. But the system doesn't work that way. It's not just about her. It's about the victim, the family, the community, the message sent by the sentence. She writes in her journal, "I thought if I changed, it would matter. But maybe it doesn't matter to anyone but me." Her therapist helps her reframe that thought. It does matter, not in the way she hoped, not in a way that shortens her sentence, but in a way that will shape the rest of her life. The person she's becoming is different from the person she was, and that's worth something, even if it doesn't unlock the doors. The chapter ends with a reflection on the nature of justice. Is it about punishment or rehabilitation? And about satisfying victims' families or reforming offenders? About proportionality or mercy? The case of Brianna and Halia doesn't provide easy answers. Both sides have legitimate claims. Halia's family deserves to see the person who killed their daughter serve a meaningful sentence. Brianna deserves credit for the work she's done to change, but reconciling those competing claims is nearly impossible. The judge tries. The system tries. But in the end, someone is always left feeling that justice wasn't fully served, and that's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of so many criminal cases. Justice is an ideal, not a destination, and the closest we can get to it is a flawed compromise that honors the complexity of human behavior without pretending we can ever make it right. 3 years to the day after her sentencing, Brianna walks out of the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She's 22 years old now, though she feels both older and younger than that number suggests. Older because of what she's lived through. Younger because the world moved on without her, and she's stepping back into it like someone waking from a coma. Her mother is waiting outside the gates, tears streaming down her face. They embrace for a long time, neither saying much, both overwhelmed by the fact that this moment has finally arrived. The drive home is quiet. Brianna stares out the window at landscapes that feel familiar and foreign at the same time. 3 years isn't long enough to change the geography, but it's long enough to change everything else. Her room is exactly as she left it, which is both comforting and unsettling. Her mother kept it preserved like a time capsule, hoping that when Brianna came home, she'd feel like she could step back into her old life. But Brianna knows she can't. The person who lived in this room doesn't exist anymore. That person didn't understand the weight of her choices. That person carried a knife without fully grasping what it meant. That person believed fear justified any response. The person standing in this room now knows differently. She's been broken down and rebuilt in ways that can't be undone. And while she's grateful to be home, she also knows that home won't feel like home for a long time, if it ever does. Re-entry into society is harder than she expected. Legally, she's free. But practically, she's still serving a sentence. She's a convicted felon now, a label that follows her everywhere. She applies for jobs and has to check the box asking about criminal history. Most applications go unanswered. The few that result in interviews end when she has to explain what she did. Involuntary manslaughter sounds clinical on paper, but when she says it out loud, she watches potential employers' faces change. She's rejected from a cashier position at a grocery store. Are rejected from a server job at a restaurant. Rejected from an administrative assistant position at a small office. Each rejection chips away at her hope that she can rebuild a normal life. She eventually finds work at a nonprofit organization that focuses on criminal justice reform. They hire people with records specifically because they understand the barriers those individuals face. The pay is low, but the work is meaningful. She helps other formerly incarcerated people navigate re-entry, connecting them with resources, helping them fill out job applications, offering the kind of support she wishes she'd had. It's both rewarding and painful. Every person she helps is a reminder of the system she's now part of, the community of people marked by their worst decisions. She's good at the work, but it also means she can never fully escape what she did. It's always there in every conversation, every case file, every interaction. Socially, reintegration is just as difficult. Her old friends have moved on. Some are finishing college, some are starting careers, some are in relationships, getting engaged, planning futures that feel impossibly distant from where Brianna is. She tries to reconnect, but the conversations are stilted. No one knows what to say. Do they ask about prison? Do they pretend it didn't happen? Do they talk about Halia? The awkwardness is suffocating. And underlying it all is the unspoken question. How do you stay friends with someone who killed someone? Most of her friendships fade quietly, not through dramatic confrontations, but through unanswered texts and declined invitations, and the gradual realization that they've all moved into different worlds. Brianna enrolls at a small state university to finish her bachelor's degree. She attends classes online mostly, avoiding campus where she might be recognized. The case was well covered locally, and she knows that people remember. She doesn't want to deal with the stares, the whispers, the judgments. Online, she can be anonymous. Just another student in a Zoom window. She majors in social work, driven by a desire to help people in ways that might somehow balance the harm she caused. It's not atonement. Nothing can atone for taking a life. But it's a direction, a purpose, something to build toward in a future that often feels empty. Therapy continues. Her therapist on the outside is different from the one in prison, but the work is similar. Processing guilt, managing triggers, developing coping strategies for the PTSD that sometimes overwhelms her. She has nightmares where she's back in the parking lot, where she can see Halia's face, where she tries to stop herself from using the knife, but her body won't obey. She wakes up sweating, gasping, the weight of what she did pressing down on her chest like a stone. Her therapist teaches her grounding techniques, breathing exercises, mantras, but nothing fully erases the nightmares. They're her companions now, a nightly reminder of the life she took. Brianna thinks often about writing to Halia's family. She drafts letters that she never sends, apologies that feel inadequate, explanations that sound like excuses. She knows they don't want to hear from her, that any contact would only reopen wounds. But the desire to say something, and to acknowledge the harm in a way that feels more personal than a courtroom statement, gnaws at her. Her therapist advises against it. Your need to apologize is about your guilt, not their healing, she's told. They don't owe you forgiveness, and reaching out might do more harm than good. Brianna knows that's true, but it doesn't make the guilt any easier to carry. She attends a victim impact panel as a speaker, sharing her story with a group of teenagers from a local high school. And she talks about that night in the parking lot, about the text messages she sent, about the knife she carried, about the split second where everything changed. She tells them that she thought she was defending herself, that she was afraid, that she believed she had no choice. But I did have choices, she says. I could have stayed inside the store. I could have called the police. I could have left the knife at home. And I didn't make any of those choices. And now, someone is dead because of me. The students listen in silence. Some look uncomfortable. Some look skeptical. But a few look like her words are landing. And if even one of them thinks twice before carrying a weapon, before escalating a confrontation, before letting pride override common sense, maybe that's worth something. The chapter ends with Brianna standing at a crossroads, both literally and metaphorically. She's standing at an intersection near her house, waiting for the light to change. She thinks about the different paths her life could take from here. She could let guilt consume her, could spiral into depression and self-destruction, could become another statistic of someone who never fully recovered from their own crime. Or she could keep moving forward, keep working, keep trying to become someone who contributes more than they took. The light changes. She crosses the street. It's not a moment of redemption. There's no sudden clarity or peace. It's just a step. One of thousands she'll have to take in a life that will forever be defined by one terrible night. She's free from prison, but she'll never be free from what she did. And learning to live with that, to carry it without being crushed by it, is the work of the rest of her life. 5 years after Halia's death, her family has learned to function, but not to heal. There's a difference. Functioning means getting out of bed, going to work, cooking meals, paying bills. Healing means the wound closes, and their wound hasn't closed. It never will. Vicky and Harley still visit Halia's grave every week. They bring fresh flowers. They clean the headstone. They sit on the bench nearby and talk to her about things that don't matter and things that matter deeply. Sometimes they talk about the weather. Sometimes they talk about how much they miss her. Sometimes they just sit in silence, the presence of her absence filling the space between them. Halia's bedroom has finally been packed up, though it took 3 years before they could bring themselves to do it. Vicky kept putting it off, finding reasons to delay. But eventually, it became clear that leaving the room frozen in time wasn't honoring Halia's memory. It was just avoiding the pain of letting go. So one weekend, the family gathered and carefully boxed up her belongings. Her clothes were donated to a shelter for young women in recovery, a fitting tribute to her journey. Her photos and personal items were distributed among family members who wanted to keep pieces of her close. Her room is now a guest room, repainted in neutral tones, stripped of the personality that once filled it. It's practical, but every time Vicky walks past it, she feels the loss all over again. The scholarship fund has grown. What started as a small memorial has become a more substantial program, thanks to community donations and fundraising events. Every year, multiple students receive support to pursue education while maintaining their sobriety. The recipients are invited to an annual dinner where they meet Halia's family, hear stories about her, and share their own journeys. It's bittersweet. The family loves seeing young people succeed, loves knowing that Halia's legacy is helping others. But it's also a stark reminder that she's not there to benefit from her own legacy. She should be one of those students, sitting at that table, celebrating her own accomplishments. Instead, she's a memory, a name on a plaque, a story told to strangers. Halia's brother has struggled the most. The trauma of holding her as she died has left scars that therapy can only partially address. He's been diagnosed with PTSD. He has panic attacks triggered by unexpected things: the smell of blood, the sound of sirens, even the sight of certain parking lots. He's had trouble maintaining relationships because the emotional weight he carries is too much for most people to handle. He's tried different therapies, different medications, different coping strategies. Some help, none fully work. He carries survivor's guilt even though there's nothing he could have done differently. Intellectually, he knows that. Emotionally, he can't accept it. He believes he should have saved her. And that belief haunts him every single day. The family's relationship with the justice system is complicated. On one hand, Brianna was convicted and served time. That's more than some families get. But on the other hand, 3 years felt inadequate from the start, and knowing that Brianna is now free makes it feel even more so. They see news stories about her occasionally, about her work with the nonprofit, about her speaking to schools. And every time they see her name, the wound reopens. They're glad she's trying to do something positive. They're glad she's not pretending her crime didn't happen. But they also can't help feeling that she got her life back while Halia never will. It's not that they want Brianna to suffer forever. It's that no amount of suffering will ever balance the scales. Vicky has become a vocal advocate for victims' rights and criminal justice reform, though her version of reform looks different from Brianna's. She pushes for longer sentences for violent crimes, for stricter penalties for offenders who use weapons, for fewer plea deals that reduce serious charges. She speaks at legislative hearings, writes letters to lawmakers, organizes rallies. Some people support her efforts. Others argue that she's letting grief drive her toward punitive policies that won't actually make anyone safer. She doesn't care about the criticism. She's fighting for Halia. And if her advocacy prevents even one other family from experiencing this pain, it's worth the pushback. Harley has taken a quieter approach. He doesn't speak publicly often, but when he does, his words carry weight. He talks about the practical realities of loss that no one prepares you for. The financial burden, the strain on marriages. He and Vicky nearly divorced in the first 2 years after Halia's death, because grief pulled them in different directions. The way holidays and anniversaries become landmines. The awkwardness of social interactions where people don't know whether to mention Halia or pretend she never existed. He's brutally honest about the fact that life doesn't go back to normal after loss. It just becomes a different kind of normal, one where you learn to carry the weight without letting it completely destroy you. The family has mixed feelings about Brianna's public redemption narrative. They see the interviews, the articles framing her as someone who made a terrible mistake but is working to make amends. And while they understand that's part of re-entry and rehabilitation, it also feels like Halia's death is being repackaged as a learning experience. As a cautionary tale, as something that happened to Brianna rather than something Brianna caused. They don't think Brianna is intentionally centering herself in a story that should be about Halia, but the media does it for her. And every time they see a headline about the woman who turned her life around after a tragic incident, they want to scream. Because it wasn't an incident. It was a killing. And the victim's name should be the one everyone remembers, not the perpetrators. Halia's friends have scattered. Some stayed in Columbus. Some moved away, needing distance from the place where their friend died. They stay in touch through social media, sharing memories on Halia's birthday and on the anniversary of her death. They post photos and stories, keeping her alive in the only way they can. But as the years pass, the posts become less frequent, not because they've forgotten, but because life moves forward. They're building careers, starting families, dealing with their own challenges. Halia becomes a part of their past rather than their present. And while that's natural and necessary, it's also painful for her family to watch. And they want everyone to remember her as vividly as they do, but they know that's not realistic. Grief is more intense for those who are closest. And as time passes, the circle of people actively grieving shrinks. The chapter ends with Halia's family gathered at her grave on the 5th anniversary of her death. It's become a tradition. They come together, all of them, and spend the day remembering. They bring a picnic lunch and eat it on the grass near her headstone. They tell stories about her. Some they've told 100 times before. They cry, they laugh, they hold each other, and they make a promise they make every year to keep fighting, to keep her memory alive, to make sure her death meant something more than just a tragedy. They know they can't bring her back. They know justice will never feel complete. But they can love her, they can honor her, and they can make sure that everyone who hears her story understands that she was more than a victim. She was a daughter, or a granddaughter, a sister, a friend. She was a person with dreams and struggles and a future that should have been, and she deserved so much more than she got. Looking back at the case of Brianna Berezini and Halia Culbertson, it's impossible not to ask the question that haunts every preventable tragedy. Could this have been stopped? The answer, uncomfortable as it is yes, not easily, not through any single intervention, but through a series of small choices made differently at various points along the way. This chapter examines those missed opportunities, not to assign blame beyond what's already been assigned, but to understand how a system, social, legal, educational, can fail to catch someone before they fall. The first missed opportunity came months before the fatal encounter, when Brianna and Halia's friendship fell apart. Teenage friendships end all the time, and most don't result in violence. But the intensity of their falling out, the threats that were reportedly made on both sides, the escalating animosity, all of that created a situation that adults in their lives should have noticed. Did teachers see tension between them at school? Did friends witness concerning behavior? Did family members hear about the conflict? The answer is almost certainly yes. But no one intervened in a meaningful way. No one sat both girls down and facilitated a conversation. No one suggested mediation. No one took the threat seriously enough to involve authorities, because teenagers say things they don't mean all the time, until suddenly they do mean them. Schools are often the front line of conflict prevention, and yet they're woefully under-resourced when it comes to actually addressing conflict. Most schools have anti-bullying programs and policies about fighting, but those programs are reactive rather than proactive. They punish students after incidents occur, rather than teaching them skills to de-escalate before incidents happen. Conflict resolution training, when it exists at all, is usually cursory. A 1-hour assembly, a poster in the hallway. Not the kind of deep, sustained education that actually changes how young people respond to interpersonal tension. If schools prioritize teaching de-escalation, emotional regulation, and nonviolent communication with the same intensity they prioritize standardized testing, would it make a difference? Research suggests it would. But that requires funding, training, and a cultural shift that hasn't happened yet. The text messages Brianna sent threatening violence were another missed opportunity. She sent those messages to friends. At least one person saw them and didn't report them to anyone who could intervene. Why? Partly because there's a culture among teenagers of not snitching, of handling things within the peer group rather than involving adults. But also because threats on social media and in text messages are so common that they've been normalized. Young people say things like, "I'm going to kill you," or "I'll stab that person," without literal intent, and it's understood as hyperbole, except when it's not. The challenge is that there's no easy way to distinguish between venting and genuine intent until it's too late. But that difficulty doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Digital literacy programs that teach young people to recognize warning signs, combined with reporting mechanisms that are safe and don't result in social ostracism, could potentially catch threats before they escalate. The night of the incident itself presented multiple intervention points that were missed. When the confrontation started inside the convenience store, an employee told Halia and her friends to leave. That was appropriate, but no one called the police. Why? Probably because it didn't seem serious enough yet. Just two girls arguing. They'll cool off and go their separate ways. Except they didn't. They escalated. If the store employee had called the police the moment the confrontation started, officers might have arrived before the stabbing occurred. They might have separated the girls, or de-escalated the situation, and ensured everyone went home alive. But that requires employees to be trained in when and how to call for help, and to feel empowered to do so even when it might seem like an overreaction. The crowd of onlookers outside the store was perhaps the most glaring missed opportunity. Dozens of people watched the confrontation unfold. They filmed it, they cheered it on, they treated it like entertainment. But not one person physically intervened to stop it until it was too late. There's a psychological phenomenon called the bystander effect, where the presence of other people reduces the likelihood that any individual will take action. Everyone assumes someone else will step in, so no one does. But the bystander effect isn't an excuse. It's a documented problem that can be addressed through education and training. Teaching people, especially young people, that they have a responsibility to intervene in situations where someone might get hurt could potentially save lives. Not through physical intervention necessarily, which can be dangerous, but through calling for help, verbally interrupting, creating distractions, doing something other than standing by with a phone. The criminal justice system's role in prevention is more complicated. By the time someone is in the system, prevention has already failed. But the way cases are prosecuted and sentenced does send messages that can influence future behavior. In Brianna's case, the plea deal and the 3-year sentence sent mixed messages. To some, it signaled that the system takes violence seriously. To others, it signaled that if you have a clean record and a good lawyer, you can kill someone and serve minimal time. Both interpretations have consequences. The first might deter future violence. The second might embolden it. There's no perfect answer here, but there is a conversation worth having about whether justice focused solely on punishment and rehabilitation serves the broader goal of prevention, or whether restorative justice models that involve community healing might be more effective. Mental health services are another critical piece of the prevention puzzle. Both girls would have benefited from better access to mental health support. Halia was a recovering addict dealing with the trauma of addiction and the ongoing challenge of sobriety. She likely needed more comprehensive mental health care than she was receiving. Brianna was dealing with anxiety and fear that escalated into carrying a weapon. She needed help managing those feelings before they led to violence. But mental health care is expensive, often inaccessible, and heavily stigmatized, especially among teenagers. Schools typically have one counselor for hundreds of students, and that counselor is usually overwhelmed with administrative tasks rather than providing actual therapy. Community mental health centers have long wait lists. Private therapy is out of reach for many families. If mental health care were as accessible as physical health care, would tragedies like this be less common? Almost certainly. Finally, there's the question of weapons. Brianna carried a knife from her workplace. It was legal, like she had a right to have it. But did she need to have it that night? The research on weapons is clear. Their presence escalates conflicts. A fistfight without weapons typically ends with bruises. A fistfight with weapons often ends with death. If Brianna hadn't had that knife, Halia would likely still be alive. That doesn't absolve Brianna of responsibility, but it does raise questions about how casually we treat weapon carrying in this country. Not just guns, but knives, which are often overlooked in conversations about violence prevention. Teaching young people to think critically about why they carry weapons, about what carrying a weapon signals both to themselves and others, and about the statistical reality that weapons are more likely to be used than to provide protection, that education could potentially shift behavior. The chapter ends with a sobering reflection. No single intervention would have definitely prevented this tragedy. But a combination of them, better conflict resolution in schools, accessible mental health care, bystander intervention training, responsible decisions about weapon carrying, and social media literacy, could have created enough barriers that the night of March 26, 2023, ended differently. Prevention isn't about perfection. It's about creating enough layers of intervention that tragedies become less likely. And right now, those layers are thin. Too thin. Which means that somewhere tonight, another pair of teenagers is on a collision course toward violence. And unless we build stronger systems of prevention, another family will soon be sitting in a courtroom, another life will be cut short, and we'll ask ourselves again why no one stopped it before it was too late. Brianna Berezini is now 25 years old. She lives in a small apartment in a suburb outside Columbus. Yeah, it's far enough from the scene of the crime that she's less likely to be recognized, but close enough to her family for support. She works full-time at the nonprofit that hired her after her release, and she's pursuing a master's degree in social work part-time. Her life is quiet, almost deliberately so. She doesn't go out much. She doesn't date. She doesn't post on social media under her real name. She's built a life that's functional but small, bounded by the reality that she'll always be defined by the worst thing she ever did. She's accepted that she'll never have a normal life, that job opportunities will always be limited, that relationships will always be complicated by her past. But she's also found a sense of purpose in helping others navigate re-entry and rehabilitation. It's not redemption, but it's something. She still sees her therapist weekly. The work of managing guilt, PTSD, and the ongoing challenge of reintegration never really ends. She's learned coping strategies, but there are still hard days. Days when the weight of what she did feels unbearable. Days when she questions whether she deserves to be happy, to have a future, to experience joy. Her therapist reminds her that punishment doesn't mean she has to torture herself forever, that she served her legal sentence and now has to find a way to live with herself. Some days she believes that. Other days she doesn't. She's written a longer letter to Halia's family, one she keeps in a drawer and has never sent. She's not sure she ever will. But writing it helps. It's a way of acknowledging the harm that goes beyond courtroom statements. Brianna's relationship with her family is better than it was immediately after her release, but it's still complicated. Her mother loves her fiercely, but also struggles with anger and disappointment that she can't always hide. And her stepfather maintains a polite distance, supportive, but not particularly close. Family gatherings are awkward. Conversations avoid certain topics: Halia, the case, prison. There's an unspoken agreement that everyone is trying to move forward, even though none of them quite know how. Brianna's brother, the one she was on the phone with that night, has distanced himself more than anyone. He feels guilty that he didn't sense something was wrong, that he didn't tell her to stay inside the store, that he couldn't protect her from herself. They talk occasionally, but the closeness they once shared is gone. Halia's family continues their advocacy work. Vicky has become a fixture at local and state legislative sessions, pushing for victims' rights, for stricter sentencing, for better support for families navigating the criminal justice system. She's testified before committees, been quoted in newspapers, and built a network of other advocates who share her passion. The work gives her life structure and purpose at a time when both are desperately needed. Harley is less publicly active, but no less committed. He focuses on the scholarship fund, on ensuring that the program grows and reaches more young people. He finds meaning in watching recipients succeed, in knowing that Halia's name is attached to something positive. Halia's brother is still struggling. He's in his mid-20s now, but he's been unable to build the kind of stable life his peers have. He's moved multiple times, unable to settle anywhere that doesn't carry memories of his sister. He's been in and out of therapy, sometimes engaging fully, other times disappearing for months before crisis brings him back. He's had jobs, but nothing long-term. He's had relationships, but nothing lasting. The trauma he carries is a constant companion, and he hasn't yet figured out how to coexist with it. His family worries about him. They push him toward treatment, toward stability, toward healing. But they also understand that his journey is his own, that he has to find his way through the darkness at his own pace. They just hope he finds it before the darkness consumes him completely. The community where the tragedy occurred has moved on in the way communities do. 161. Carry Out is still open, still serving customers who have no idea that a teenage girl died in the parking lot outside. There's no memorial, no plaque, nothing marking the spot where Halia fell. Her family has mixed feelings about that. Part of them wants everyone to remember, to honor the place where her life ended. Another part of them understands that life goes on, that the world doesn't stop for grief, that people need to buy snacks and cigarettes and lottery tickets without being reminded of tragedy. Occasionally, on the anniversary of Halia's death, someone leaves flowers in the parking lot. Usually it's family or close friends. Sometimes it's people who didn't know her but heard her story and felt moved. The flowers stay for a few days, then fade, then disappear, just like the public memory of what happened that night. Some of Halia's friends have found ways to channel their grief into activism. One started an organization focused on conflict resolution in schools. Another works with teens in recovery, honoring Halia's journey by helping others navigate theirs. A third became a social worker specializing in trauma. I'm directly inspired by the loss of her friend. Their work doesn't bring Halia back, but it gives meaning to her death in ways that help them cope. Others have struggled more. Some developed substance abuse issues after her death, using drugs or alcohol to numb the pain. Some dropped out of school, unable to focus or see the point of continuing. Trauma ripples outward in unpredictable ways, affecting different people differently. And 5 years later, those ripples are still being felt. Our Brianna and Halia's story has become part of the local folklore. It's a cautionary tale shared in schools, in youth groups, in community centers. Sometimes it's told accurately. Often it's not. Details get distorted. Motives get simplified. Both girls get reduced to types, the violent one, the scared one, rather than complex human beings who made choices in a moment of fear and anger and pride. Neither girl is purely villain or victim, but that nuance is often lost in the retelling. To some, Brianna is a murderer who got off easy. To others, she's a victim of circumstances who defended herself. To some, Halia is a recovering addict who was unfairly killed. To others, she's an aggressor who paid the ultimate price for her actions. The truth, as always, is more complicated than any single narrative can capture. The legal system has moved on to other cases. Prosecutors and defense attorneys who worked on Brianna's case have handled dozens more since then. Our judges have presided over hundreds of hearings. For them, this was one case among many. Significant, yes, but not defining. That's the nature of the system. For the families involved, this case is everything. For the professionals, it's a file that's been closed and archived. Both realities are true, and the disconnect between them is part of what makes navigating the justice system so difficult for families. The system treats cases as transactions to be processed. Families treat cases as tragedies to be mourned, and those two perspectives rarely align in ways that feel satisfying. The chapter ends with a quiet reflection. 5 years after the night that changed everything, both Brianna and Halia's family are still living with the consequences. Brianna is trying to build a life defined by more than her worst moment. Halia's family is trying to honor her memory while also moving forward with their own lives. Neither task is easy. Neither will ever be complete. They're carrying different kinds of weight, but weight nonetheless. And they'll carry it for the rest of their lives. There's no happy ending here, no redemption arc that makes everything okay. Just two families trying to survive a tragedy that should never have happened. trying to find meaning in loss, trying to keep going when part of them died in that parking lot 5 years ago. This story didn't have to end the way it did. That's the thought that echoes through every chapter, every hearing, every tear-stained conversation. Brianna didn't wake up on March 26, 2023, planning to kill someone. Halia didn't walk into 161 carryout expecting to die. But a series of choices, each small on its own, created a trajectory that ended with a knife in a parking lot and a 17-year-old girl bleeding out while her brother held her. And that's what makes this case so haunting. It wasn't inevitable, it was preventable, but it happened anyway. Because prevention requires intention, resources, and a willingness to intervene before things spiral. And in this case, those elements weren't present. The line between a confrontation that ends with hurt feelings and one that ends with death is thinner than most people realize. It's the line between having a weapon and not having one, between being filmed by a crowd and being stopped by a crowd, between fear that drives you to retreat and fear that drives you to attack. Brianna crossed that line in a matter of seconds, and once she crossed it, there was no going back. That's the terrifying reality of violence. It's irreversible. You can't unstab someone. You can't take back the moment where the blade enters skin. You can apologize, serve time, dedicate your life to making amends. But you can't undo the harm. And that's a burden Brianna will carry forever, just as Halia's family will carry their loss forever. This case forces uncomfortable questions about self-defense. At what point does protecting yourself become excessive force? The law tries to draw clear lines, but human behavior is messy. Brianna genuinely felt afraid. The video shows her backing away. But she also carried a knife, sent threatening texts, and used that knife in a way that went beyond what was necessary to stop the threat. Does fear justify any response? Or does fear have to be proportional? And how do we expect someone in a moment of panic to calculate proportionality when their brain is flooded with adrenaline and their judgment is compromised? These aren't easy questions, and the legal system's answers don't always satisfy the moral intuitions of the people affected. The role of technology in this tragedy can't be ignored. The confrontation was filmed. The crowd was more focused on capturing content than preventing harm. And that says something deeply troubling about our culture. We've become a society of spectators, documenting everything, consuming violence as entertainment, divorcing ourselves from the reality that the people on our screens are real human beings experiencing real suffering. If even one person in that parking lot had put their phone down and physically intervened, Halia might still be alive. But intervention requires courage. It requires overriding the instinct to stay safe, to not get involved, to let someone else handle it. And in a culture that rewards content creation over community care, those instincts are increasingly rare. The justice system did its job, more or less. Brianna was arrested, charged, convicted, and sentenced. Halia's family had the opportunity to give victim impact statements. The process was followed. But did justice feel just? To Halia's family? No. To Brianna's family? Maybe. To the community, it depends on who you ask. And that reveals a fundamental truth about justice. It's not an objective outcome. It's a subjective experience shaped by proximity to harm, personal values, cultural background, and countless other factors. The same sentence can feel like mercy to one person and cruelty to another. And there's no resolution to that tension. We can only try to balance competing needs and hope that the outcome is close enough to fairness that most people can live with it, even if no one is fully satisfied. Forgiveness is another complicated piece of this story. Halia's family hasn't forgiven Brianna. They may never forgive her, and they don't have to. Forgiveness isn't something that can be demanded or expected. It's a gift that victims can choose to give or withhold, and either choice is valid. Some people believe forgiveness is necessary for healing. Others believe that forgiveness without genuine accountability is meaningless. Halia's family falls somewhere in the middle. They acknowledge that Brianna has taken steps toward accountability, but they also believe that no amount of accountability will ever be enough, and they're entitled to that belief. Forgiveness, if it comes at all, will come on their timeline, not anyone else's. And it may never come. And that's okay. Brianna has had to learn to live without forgiveness. She can't wait for Halia's family to absolve her. She can't predicate her ability to move forward on their approval. She has to find a way to forgive herself, which is perhaps even harder, because she knows what she did. She carries the memory of that night in her body, in her nightmares, in the reflexive flinch when someone raises their voice. Self-forgiveness doesn't mean excusing her actions or minimizing the harm. It means accepting that she's a person who did a terrible thing and that she has to find a way to live with that reality without destroying herself in the process. Some days she manages. Other days she doesn't, and that's the ongoing work of rehabilitation that extends far beyond prison walls. The broader implications of this case are worth considering. How many other Briannas are out there? How many young people are carrying weapons, harboring grudges, rehearsing violence in their minds, convinced that they're not the type to kill until suddenly they are? How many other Halias are out there, caught in conflicts they didn't fully understand, targeted by insults that weaponize their most vulnerable wounds, waiting outside convenience stores for confrontations that will end their lives? These patterns repeat. The names change, the locations change, but the underlying dynamics remain eerily similar. And until we address those dynamics, until we invest in prevention, mental health care, conflict resolution, and community intervention, the tragedies will continue. This case is also a story about class, privilege, and access to resources. Brianna had a lawyer who knew how to negotiate a favorable plea. She had a family who could post bond. She had access to therapy, education programs, and support systems that helped her through incarceration and re-entry. Not everyone gets that. Defendants from poorer backgrounds, defendants of color, defendants without networks of support often face harsher charges, longer sentences, and fewer opportunities for rehabilitation. That doesn't mean Brianna didn't suffer or that her punishment wasn't real. It means the system is unequal, and acknowledging that inequality is necessary if we want justice to mean anything more than outcomes determined by who can afford the best lawyer. There's no neat conclusion to this story, no moment where everything makes sense and everyone finds peace. Brianna is trying to rebuild a life marked by irreversible harm. Halia's family is trying to honor her memory while also moving forward with their own lives. The community is trying to learn from the tragedy without becoming paralyzed by it. The justice system is moving on to the next case, the next defendant, the next victim. And somewhere, another teenager is carrying a weapon they don't fully understand. Another friendship is disintegrating into enmity. Another conflict is escalating toward violence. The cycle continues. And unless we break it, through education, intervention, and a cultural shift that values life more than pride, stories like this will keep happening. The final reflection is this. Halia Culbertson should be alive. She should be 22 years old, pursuing dreams, building relationships, celebrating her recovery. She should be here. And the fact that she's not is a failure. A failure of individuals who made bad choices, a failure of systems that didn't intervene, a failure of a culture that normalizes violence and weaponry. We can't bring her back, but we can honor her by doing better, by building the kind of world where confrontations don't end in death, where fear doesn't justify lethal force, where teenagers learn to walk away before it's too late. That world is possible, but it requires all of us to take responsibility, to intervene, to care, to choose life over pride. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us make that choice, The next Brianna and the next Talia will both walk away from their parking lot, bruised, angry, but alive, and that would be justice, not perfect, but real and desperately needed.